beneath the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, where two great rivers once carved life into the desert, the first chapters of human civilization were written. Long before Greece or Rome, before Egypt raised its pyramids, the Sumerians shaped a world of cities, temples, and myths that still echo across time. Their clay tablets preserve the earliest stories. Their ziggurats reach skyward like stairways to the gods, and their language, old as dawn itself, breathed order into the chaos of the unknown. Tonight, we drift into that forgotten age. Picture the glow of oil lamps flickering against mud brick walls, the sound of reeds swaying in the marshes, the chants of priests rising to the heavens. Here, gods of sky and water ruled alongside kings of flesh and blood. Here, writing was born, astronomy charted the stars, and law gave shape to the lives of countless generations. Yet much of Sumer's world remains veiled, its mysteries scattered in fragments of stone and silence. Who were these people who first imagined eternity? And why did their cities fade into dust? Settle in, let the weight of the present fall away, and journey with us through the entire history of the lost Sumerian civilization. Chapter 1. The Land Between Two Rivers. Beneath the golden light of the Mesopotamian dawn, two great rivers cut their path through the desert, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Their waters gleamed like living silver, winding through a flat and endless horizon, leaving behind rich alluvial soil. Between them lay a world unlike any other, a strip of land that would cradle humanity's first great experiment in civilization. This was the land the ancients called the Eden, the plain. We know it as southern Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, the place where history itself first took root. The story of Sumer begins here, where unpredictable floods once shaped the rhythm of life. When the rivers swelled, they brought nourishment, silt, and new beginnings. When they receded, they left cracked plains, and the memory of survival etched into the minds of those who dwelt along their banks. Archaeologists tell us that by the 6th millennium BCE, small clusters of reed huts began to appear in these marshlands. These early villages, little more than footprints in the mud, gave rise to a new pattern of life. They were not yet cities, but they were something more than nomadic camps. The people who built them had chosen to stay, to cultivate, to dig canals, to trust that the rivers would sustain them year after year. The earliest of these settlements would one day bear names that resound through time. Eridu, Lagash, Uruk. They began as quiet hamlets, their inhabitants fashioning clay figurines, storing grain in baskets, and worshipping local river spirits. And yet, slowly, something extraordinary unfolded. The reed huts became mud brick houses. The shrines grew into temples. The temples became centers of power. By the 4th millennium BCE, a transformation had taken place. These villages had become the world's first true cities, places where thousands gathered under the authority of priest kings, where irrigation canals stretched for miles, and where the first experiments with writing took shape on wet clay. Southern Mesopotamia is not a gentle land. Unlike the predictable floods of the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates were wild and often destructive. A single unexpected flood could wipe out entire harvests. Droughts could turn fields to dust. This harshness shaped the character of those early settlers. They learned to harness the waters with levees and canals, building an intricate web of irrigation that allowed them to grow barley and wheat on a scale never before possible. With surplus grain came stability. With stability came specialization. Potters, weavers, and builders. And with specialization came hierarchy. It was here that humanity crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. Yet the deeper we dig into the soil of Mesopotamia, the more we realize how much remains hidden. Beneath the surface lie tells, great mounds of earth concealing the layered remains of generations. Each layer is a time capsule, one of a hut, one of a temple, one of a burned city. Archaeologists peel them back carefully, like pages of a forgotten book. At Eridu, they found 18 successive temple platforms, each one built atop the ruins of the last, forming a stairway of memory reaching back into prehistory. To walk among these ruins is to feel the weight of human persistence, the endless cycle of creation, destruction, and renewal. But why here? Why did civilization arise first between these rivers and not elsewhere? Scholars have long debated this question. Some argue it was necessity. The challenge of taming these rivers forced cooperation, engineering, and governance. Others suggest it was trade, that these river networks became highways of exchange connecting villages and distant peoples. Still others see something more elusive, a spark of imagination, perhaps encoded in myth. The Sumerians themselves claimed that kingship descended from heaven, that civilization was a gift of the gods. The god Enki, they said, brought wisdom from the freshwater abyss and taught humankind the arts of survival. Even today, the land holds its secrets. Satellite imagery reveals the ghostly lines of ancient canals and riverbeds, many now dry, suggesting that the landscape of early Sumer was very different from what we see today. Entire cities may lie buried beneath silt, hidden for millennia, waiting to be rediscovered. Some archaeologists believe there were once more settlements, now lost, that predate even Eridu, hinting that the story of civilization's birth may stretch back further than we dare to imagine. Standing on the plains between the rivers, one can almost hear the echo of water wheels turning, the lowing of cattle, the chanting of priests atop ziggurats. It is a place where myth and history blur together. The Sumerian flood stories, precursors to the biblical deluge, may have been inspired by catastrophic inundations that swept through these very plains, erasing entire communities overnight. To the survivors, such floods must have felt like divine judgment, reshaping not just the land but the psyche of a people. In this crucible of mud, water, and sun, humanity forged its first cities, its first laws, its first dreams of eternity. This was the beginning, fragile, perilous, but unstoppable. The land between the rivers became the world's first stage, where kings, scribes, and gods would act out the earliest dramas of recorded history. And yet, even as we reconstruct this story from ruins and clay, we are left with the sense that we are seeing only fragments, pieces of a much larger puzzle. The cradle of civilization still whispers. Its rivers still shift, burying and revealing in turn. For every city excavated, there are 10 that lie waiting. For every tablet translated, 1,000 remain unread. The land between the rivers is not just where history began. It is where history is still being uncovered, grain by grain, tablet by tablet, as we search for the first footprints of ourselves. And so we linger here, at the threshold of time, gazing out over a plain that once turned to a garden of temples and towers. The Tigris and Euphrates continue their slow, ceaseless flow, as they have for thousands of years, carrying silt, memory, and silence toward the sea. Somewhere in their currents, the first chapter of human civilization is still unfolding. A chapter that leads us deeper, toward the first city and the first king. Chapter 2. Eridu. The first city, in the far south of Mesopotamia, where the waters of the Euphrates once fanned into marshlands and lagoons, there rose a settlement unlike any before it. To the Sumerians, it was more than stone and clay, more than walls and shrines. It was the cradle of order itself, the place where civilization took root. They called it Eridu, a name carried in hymns and myths as the first city ever to emerge upon the earth. Archaeologists would later uncover its remains beneath the barren desert, near modern-day Tel Abu Shahrain in Iraq. Beneath the sand lay layer upon layer of ancient building, stacked one atop the other like the rings of a great tree. 18 times over the span of centuries, its central temple had been rebuilt, each generation raising a new sanctuary upon the ruins of the last. These were not ordinary shrines. They were houses for the god Enki, lord of fresh waters, keeper of wisdom, the divine trickster whose word could shape destiny itself. To the people of Sumer, Eridu was not simply the first city. It was the dwelling place of the gods on earth. The Sumerian King List, that enigmatic record of rulers both mythical and mortal, begins with Eridu. It tells us that kingship, the divine mandate to rule, first descended from heaven to this city. The earliest kings of Eridu were said to reign for impossibly long spans, tens of thousands of years. To modern eyes, these reigns appear as legend, yet they mark the city's special place in memory. Eridu was more than the birthplace of kingship. It was where the threshold between heaven and earth seemed thinnest, where human rule and divine order were first intertwined. The excavations of the 1940s and 50s revealed a city that grew slowly, from a modest village in the 6th millennium BCE to a thriving center of ritual life. At its heart stood the temple to Enki, built first of reed matting, then of mud brick, and later of fired clay. Each rebuilding was larger than the last, as if generation by generation, the people reached higher toward their god. Within its walls, priests performed offerings beside altars, and perhaps recited the incantations that later appear in Sumerian texts. Chants for purification, for healing, for wisdom drawn from the subterranean waters Enki governed. Around the sacred precinct stretched a community of houses, canals, and workshops. Clay tokens and early seals suggest Eridu was already a center of trade. Its people fished the marshes, herded cattle, and cultivated barley in the silty earth brought by the shifting waters of the Euphrates. To them, water was both lifeblood and mystery. Beneath the marshes lay the Abzu, the cosmic deep, source of all creation, over which Enki ruled. Living at Eridu meant dwelling at the threshold between the human and the eternal. As centuries passed, Eridu became the model upon which later cities were patterned. The sequence of its temples, rebuilt 18 times across more than 3,000 years, charts the unfolding of Sumerian religious architecture. In those superimposed walls, archaeologists glimpse the transition from reed huts to monumental ziggurats. Some scholars believe that the towering stepped pyramids of later Mesopotamian cities were inspired by the accumulated mounds of earlier sanctuaries like Eridu, each new level raised closer to the sky. And yet, for all its importance, Eridu did not last forever. By the 3rd millennium BCE, while neighboring cities such as Ur and Uruk were rising to new heights of power, Eridu began to wane. Its once sacred precincts were abandoned, its canals choked with silt, its marshes turning to salt-encrusted desert. Archaeological layers show signs of shrinking population, of structures falling into disuse. By around 2000 BCE, the city that Sumerian tradition called the first of all cities lay silent, left to crumble beneath the desert winds. Why this decline occurred remains uncertain. Some point to environmental change, the slow drying of the marshes, the shifting of the Euphrates away from its former channels, and the creeping salinization of farmland. Others note that religious and political centers shifted toward Ur and Uruk, whose temples and rulers eclipsed those of Eridu. Yet the abruptness of its decline raises deeper questions. How could the first city, the very seat of kingship descended from heaven, be so thoroughly forsaken? Did the people believe that Enki himself had withdrawn his favor, leaving his temple an empty shell? In the mythology of Sumer, Eridu remains a place of beginnings. The Epic of Creation tells how Enki established order there, setting boundaries for rivers, marshes, and fields, giving every creature its proper dwelling. Later myths describe him dwelling in his watery house beneath the temple, dispensing wisdom and secrets of craft. Even when Eridu no longer flourished, the memory of its sacred role endured. Poets of later ages still praised it as the first of cities, beloved of the gods, the place where humanity first learned how to live together. But memory is fragile. Today, the ruins of Eridu lie desolate, a scatter of crumbling walls and a low mound rising from the desert. Few travelers come here, and fewer still can imagine the life that once pulsed through its canals and courtyards. The temple mound, built up by centuries of devotion, is eroded to a shadow of its former height. What remains are fragments, shards of pottery, bricks impressed with simple designs, and the outlines of walls long collapsed. And yet, within these ruins, there is a sense of weight. To stand at Eridu is to feel the depth of time pressing upward through the soil. Every layer of earth carries the memory of a different age. Reed huts giving way to brick temples, village shrines becoming holy mountains. It is as though the ground itself remembers, even as human memory fades. For archaeologists, Eridu poses both a gift and a riddle. It offers the earliest clear sequence of religious architecture, a window into how sacred space was first imagined. But it also defies certainty. Was Eridu truly the first city, or simply the first remembered? Other settlements, Kat el-Hayuk in Anatolia, Jericho in the Levant, predate it by millennia, and yet none carried the same spiritual weight in the stories of the people who lived there. The claim of Eridu is not only archaeological, it is mythic, rooted in the belief that civilization itself was born beside Enki's watery shrine. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Eridu is its abandonment. Cities rise and fall throughout history, but to see the very first city fade into silence feels like a story with no ending. Did the last inhabitants know they were leaving behind a sacred beginning? Did they look back upon the temple mound and wonder if the gods would follow them elsewhere? or remain forever bound to that desolate place. The Sumerian King List begins with Eridu and moves onward, naming other cities, other dynasties, as the seat of kingship shifted across the land. To the Sumerians, this transfer was ordained by the gods, a pattern of rise and fall built into the fabric of time. Perhaps the loss of Eridu was not failure, but fulfillment, its role complete, its memory carried forward even as its walls crumbled. Today, the desert sands have nearly buried it, and yet its name survives, echoing in the tablets and hymns that outlived its walls. Eridu remains a reminder that civilization is both fragile and enduring, both rooted in soil and carried in story. The first city is gone, yet it is not forgotten. It lives in the myths of beginnings, in the silent weight of ruins, and in the questions that linger still. And as the wind moves over the mound of Eridu, stirring the dust of ages, one cannot help but wonder, what else lies waiting beneath the sands? What other first beginnings? What other forgotten dawns? Chapter 3, Uruk, birthplace of civilization in the dawn light of the 4th millennium BCE. A city began to rise on the southern Mesopotamian plain. A city so large, so innovative, that it would forever change the course of human history. This was Uruk, a place that transformed scattered villages into a sprawling metropolis and gave birth to what we call civilization. By around 3000 BCE, Uruk had grown into an expanse of more than 6 square kilometers, perhaps home to over 40,000 people, an unprecedented number for the ancient world. Its scale was unlike anything the earth had yet seen. Instead of reed huts and small shrines, there now stood districts of mud brick homes, ceremonial plazas, canals that divided neighborhoods, and temples that reached skyward in towering terraces. This was not merely a settlement, but a statement, an urban heartbeat that could be felt for miles across the flat horizon. At the heart of Uruk stood the Anu ziggurat, crowned with the white temple. Its shining plastered walls must have blazed in the Mesopotamian sun, visible to travelers approaching from the desert. From this elevated platform, priests oversaw rituals dedicated to Anu, the sky god. Excavations have revealed the remains of ceremonial courtyards and offering tables, as well as a vast complex of storage rooms and administrative halls. These were not just places of worship, but centers of power, hubs where religious authority, economic management, and civic order converged. The people of Uruk organized their city with remarkable sophistication. The so-called Inanna precinct, another massive temple district, this one dedicated to the goddess Inanna, was lined with monumental halls, carved stone troughs, and ceremonial staircases. Some archaeologists suggest that this area functioned almost like a sacred administrative center, where offerings of grain, beer, and livestock were collected and redistributed. Temple economies became the backbone of the city, supporting thousands of laborers, artisans, and farmers who depended on the temple granaries for sustenance. One of Uruk's most enduring legacies was the invention of writing. Within the city's ruins, archaeologists uncovered thousands of clay tablets incised with the earliest known proto-cuneiform script. These tablets, dating to around 3200 BCE, record lists of goods, measures of barley, and tallies of animals. At first, writing was a tool of accountants, a way to track the flow of resources that kept Uruk running. But from these humble beginnings would grow the entire tradition of Mesopotamian literature, law, and history. Each wedge-shaped impression pressed into wet clay became a seed from which whole libraries would one day emerge. The very rhythm of life in Uruk was regulated by this new administrative order. Clay tokens and bullae, hollow clay envelopes, were used to store counts of commodities. Cylinder seals, tiny masterpieces of carved stone, allowed officials to sign documents and secure storerooms. These artifacts, now scattered in museum cases around the world, offer a glimpse into a society that had learned to govern complexity, to impose order on the chaos of human need and production. But Uruk was not just a city of ledgers and storehouses. It was also a place of myth and imagination. The city's legendary king, Gilgamesh, became the central figure of the world's first epic. His story, preserved on clay tablets millennia later, tells of a ruler who built mighty walls around his city. Walls so strong, the poem says, that their foundation bricks still bear his name. Whether Gilgamesh was a real king or a mythic composite of many rulers remains uncertain. Yet the very presence of those walls, their courses still traceable in the soil, gives his legend a strange weight, as if his shadow still lingers over the desert plain. The walls of Uruk were an engineering marvel, encircling the city with miles of baked brick fortifications. They were both practical and symbolic, a defense against raiders and a statement of permanence. To walk along their remnants today is to sense the pride of a people who had created something enduring, something that could withstand the winds of time. Uruk's influence stretched far beyond its own territory. Archaeologists have discovered artifacts in distant regions, from Syria to Iran, that bear the unmistakable stamp of Uruk's style. Pottery, cylinder seals, and architectural techniques suggest that the city's merchants and settlers carried its culture outward in what scholars call the Uruk expansion. For a time, it seems, the world was being remade in Uruk's image. Yet, even amid its grandeur, Uruk was not immune to change. Its rise was followed by cycles of contraction, abandonment, and renewal. The reasons remain debated: climate shifts, rival city-states, shifting trade routes. But Uruk's memory never faded. For centuries after its peak, scribes continued to speak of it as the archetypal city, the first place where gods and humans met, where writing was born, where kingship was established. Walking through the archaeological site today, one finds little but low mounds, scattered bricks, and eroded foundations. The city that once glowed white in the sun is now a muted memory in the earth. And yet, there is a strange presence here. The vastness of the site, the faint lines of canals, the outline of temple terraces, all conspire to remind us that this was once the center of the human world. Uruk was the beginning of a story that has never truly ended. Every city we build today, every ledger we keep, every wall we raise, owes something to the experiment first undertaken here. And yet, as we gaze across the silent plain, we cannot help but wonder what else lies buried beneath the dust. What stories remain untold? What names still sleep in unexcavated layers of earth? The city of Gilgamesh continues to whisper, a place where myth and history intertwine. Its bricks are silent, its canals long dry, but its memory endures. The first and greatest of the cities, the one that showed humanity what was possible. And beyond its horizon waits the next chapter, the next city, the next layer of the Sumerian world, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 4. The Dawn of Writing. Beneath the vast skies of southern Mesopotamia, among the reed marshes and the glimmering waters of the Euphrates, humanity crossed a threshold unlike any other. Here, in the cities of Sumer, thought first found permanence. Words, once fleeting breath carried on the air, were pressed into clay and given form. The invention of writing was not only a tool of record, it was the moment human memory ceased to rely upon flesh and voice alone, and instead found endurance in the patient silence of symbols. The earliest evidence comes from Uruk, the great city that loomed over the 4th millennium BCE. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered thousands of small clay tablets etched with simple pictographs. At first glance, these marks resemble the tally sticks and counting tokens used by farmers and traders for centuries. But in Uruk, the marks became something more. They were arranged in patterns, repeated with subtle variations, shaped not only to count, but to convey. Sheep, grain, oil, and labor all began to be tallied in clay, as the economy of the city swelled beyond the capacity of memory alone. At Jemdet Nasr, a smaller site northeast of Uruk, similar tablets appeared, dating to around 3100 BCE. Here too, pictographs captured the rhythm of economic life. Lists of goods, measures of barley, records of animals. The earliest writing was deeply practical, a tool born of necessity, in a world where temples and storehouses gathered the wealth of the people, and scribes were needed to keep order amidst its flow. Yet behind those dry lists is something profound, the first steps of humanity toward abstraction, toward a system where thought itself could be preserved. Over centuries, the pictographs evolved. The shapes grew simplified, then rotated, as scribes pressed styluses of reed into soft clay. Lines became wedges, signs became standardized, and the script we know as cuneiform was born. By 2600 BCE, it had spread beyond economic use into realms more expansive. The same wedge-shaped signs that once counted sheep now carried hymns to the gods, royal proclamations, contracts, and incantations against the unseen forces of the world. Writing had become more than a tool. It was the voice of civilization itself. One of the most haunting aspects of this transition is the survival of the tablets themselves. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay endured. Baked accidentally in fires or deliberately hardened in kilns, the tablets resisted decay. They lie now in museums across the world, in London, in Berlin, in Baghdad, in Istanbul. Each one is a fragment of life in Sumer, a captured moment of thought from more than 5,000 years ago. Some are simple and repetitive, endless rows of numbers and goods. Others open onto poetry. From these tablets, we hear the earliest hymns, songs to Inanna, the radiant goddess of love and war, to Enlil, lord of the air, to Enki, the keeper of wisdom, whose city of Eridu once shone upon the marshes. Myths, too, found their way into clay, tales of gods shaping the world, of floods that swept away cities, of heroes who sought immortality. The epic of Gilgamesh, though surviving in later Akkadian form, has its roots in Sumerian stories pressed into tablets long before. Yet writing also revealed the ordinary. School tablets used by apprentice scribes still bear the scratchings of practice. Lines repeated over and over, mistakes scratched out, hands learning to master the stylus. Legal contracts record marriages, sales of land, the hiring of workers. Letters survive too, personal and practical, carrying voices across the centuries. Through these clay fragments we glimpse not only kings and priests, but farmers, merchants, mothers, and children, lives otherwise lost to silence. And still, vast numbers of tablets remain unread. In museums around the world, tens of thousands rest in storage, labeled but untranslated, their symbols waiting for eyes to bring them to life again. Within them lie unknown stories, forgotten names, perhaps even entire myths never before imagined. Some may contain the daily tallies of grain. Others may reveal the thoughts of poets whose words have not touched human ears for 5 millennia. The dawn of writing was not only a beginning, but a reservoir of mystery, still unspent. To the Sumerians, writing itself carried divine significance. According to later traditions, it was the god Nabu who became the patron of scribes. But in Sumer, it was the wisdom of Enki that underlay the art. To inscribe upon clay was to fix order, to capture the spoken word and grant it permanence. In this sense, writing was more than memory, it was power. Kings inscribed their victories to outlast their reigns. Priests etched rituals to ensure the gods would never be forgotten. The act of pressing a stylus into clay was itself a way of binding the world, of shaping reality through symbol. Consider the great libraries of clay that once existed. At Nippur, archives of religious texts were stored within temple walls. At scribes filled rooms with tablets cataloguing offerings, prayers, and records of celestial movements. The tradition reached its peak in later Mesopotamian ages with the vast library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, but its roots lay here in the Sumerian dawn, when clay first became the vessel of knowledge. The invention of writing also altered time itself. For countless generations before, human history had been carried in memory, in song, in story told around the fire. Each retelling changed with the teller, each memory shaped by the present moment. But with writing, words could outlive the voice. Events could be fixed, law could be codified. Memory became something external, no longer dependent on the fragile threads of oral tradition. Humanity gained permanence, but also distance. The written word could preserve, but it could also freeze, stripping stories of their living change. What was gained and what was lost in this transformation remains an open question. And yet, for all the permanence of clay, silence remains. The survival of tablets does not mean we can always understand them. Some scripts are damaged, fragmented, their meaning uncertain. Others contain words we cannot translate, concepts foreign to us. Even the language itself, Sumerian, is a linguistic isolate, unrelated to any known tongue. It lingers only in these clay fragments, its grammar reconstructed with care, but its nuances still partly hidden. We read the tablets, yet we cannot always hear the full timbre of their voices. When we look upon the earliest signs from Uruk or Jemdet Nasser, we are not only seeing the beginnings of writing, we are witnessing the dawn of abstraction, the moment thought itself became visible. From a cluster of wedges pressed into clay, an entire world emerges. Fields of grain, herds of sheep, the names of gods, the titles of kings. Writing allowed Sumer to endure beyond its ruins. Though the cities crumbled, though the marshes dried, though the people themselves vanished into the currents of time, their words remain. And still, there is mystery. In the storerooms of museums, countless tablets gather dust. What forgotten hymns sleep within them? What records of floods, famines, or forgotten dynasties? What voices, silenced for millennia, wait to be read once more? The dawn of writing was not a completed act. It was the opening of a door that still stands ajar, inviting us to enter. To stand before these clay fragments today is to feel the weight of that threshold. The first city gave us kingship, but the first script gave us something greater. The ability to remember beyond the span of breath, to speak across ages. It was and remains both gift and enigma. And as we turn each tablet over, brushing away the dust of centuries, we are reminded that for all we know, far more remains unread. The clay remembers. The question is whether we will listen. Chapter 5, The Sumerian King. List deep in the archives of Mesopotamia lies a text unlike any other, a chronicle that dares to tell the entire history of kingship itself. The Sumerian King List, inscribed on clay tablets in the wedge-shaped strokes of cuneiform, stands as one of the most enigmatic records ever recovered from the ancient world. It does not begin with a single city or dynasty, nor does it limit itself to the confines of what we call history. Instead, it reaches back into the mists of time, far beyond the first ziggurat, beyond even the first known city, into an era the text calls before the flood. It is here, in this strange prelude, that we encounter rulers whose reigns defy all comprehension. One king is said to have ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000. 8 kings in total are named before the flood, each reigning for spans that, taken together, stretch into hundreds of millennia. After the flood, the text claims, kingship was lowered from heaven once more, and the reigns become progressively shorter. First thousands of years, then hundreds, and finally, the more human lifespans we recognize from later Mesopotamian records. Archaeologists have recovered several versions of this list, the most complete being the Weld Blundell prism, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. This 4-sided clay prism, inscribed on all sides, preserves not just names, but also the order of succession and the cities that held kingship. It tells of dynasties moving from Eridu to Bad Tibira, from Larak to Sippar, and then to Shuruppak, each city ruling in its turn, as though kingship itself was a divine power passed from place to place. Independent of any one bloodline, scholars have puzzled for over a century at what this list truly represents. Is it an attempt by later scribes to unify disparate local histories into one grand narrative? Or is it a compilation of genuine records preserved across generations, stretching back into a forgotten antiquity? Some argue that the exaggerated reigns are purely symbolic, intended to convey the greatness of the earliest kings and the long golden age before the deluge. Others suggest that the numbers might encode astronomical or calendrical cycles, perhaps lunar months or ritual years, that, when converted, could bring the reigns closer to human possibility. Yet, the King List also contains details that seem strikingly historical. After the flood, many of the kings named are corroborated by inscriptions and archaeological evidence. For instance, the first dynasty of Kish includes names like Etana, described as the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign lands. Later, tablets and legends preserve the story of Etana's ascent on the back of an eagle to the heavens, a tale that blends myth with a possible memory of a real ruler. Similarly, kings of Uruk, and Lagash appear both on the King List and in contemporary economic and dedicatory texts, confirming that at least part of the sequence reflects genuine history. The flood itself, placed like a dividing line through the middle of the list, raises perhaps the most haunting question of all. Was this simply a mythic motif echoing the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah in Genesis? Or does it preserve a cultural memory of a catastrophic inundation around 2900 BCE, an event supported by some layers of silt found at sites like Shuruppak and Kish? The idea that the King List might encode a memory of real-world disaster lends weight to the possibility that its earlier entries too might hold fragments of truth, however distorted. To read the King List is to feel the texture of a civilization trying to make sense of its own past. The scribes who composed it were not merely writing history in the modern sense. They were weaving together the threads of time, myth, and cosmic order. Kingship, for them, was not a mere political office. It was a sacred trust conferred by the gods themselves. The list reminds us over and over that kingship descended from heaven, suggesting that rulership was seen as a divine principle, eternal and unbroken, even if its earthly vessels were mortal and ever-changing. Even the gaps and silences in the king list are telling. Whole dynasties are missing from some versions, perhaps deliberately omitted for political reasons. Other copies rearrange the order, favoring certain cities over others, as if the act of recording the past was itself a form of power. In this way, the king list becomes more than a neutral chronicle. It is a political and theological statement, shaping collective memory in service of those who ruled at the time it was inscribed. And yet, for all its grandeur, the king list ends not with a triumphant conclusion, but simply with the passing of kingship into yet another city. Its final lines are like an unfinished sentence, leaving the reader in quiet contemplation. Perhaps this was intentional, a reminder that history is never complete, that kingship and time itself will continue to flow like the rivers of Mesopotamia, shifting course, erasing old channels, and carving new ones. To stand before the well-blundled prism today is to confront the mystery of time. Its surface is cracked, its cuneiform signs worn, yet the voice of the scribe still speaks across 4,000 years. It calls us to imagine an age when kings reigned for thousands of years, when floods reshaped the world, and when the line between man and God was not so firmly drawn. Whether we take the king list as literal record, symbolic epic, or something in between, it challenges us to reconsider what we know about the earliest chapters of human civilization. Perhaps, somewhere beneath the desert sands, there are still tablets we have not yet found. Tablets that would fill the gaps, resolve the riddles, and confirm or deny the reigns of those shadowy pre-flood kings. Until then, the Sumerian King List stands as both guide and enigma, a map of memory pointing toward a past we can glimpse, but never fully hold. And as we move forward in this story of Sumer, we carry with us the haunting image of those impossibly long reigns, and the silent promise that history, like kingship, is never truly finished. Chapter 6, Lagash and the Reformers, in the shifting plains of southern Mesopotamia. Where the Tigris and Euphrates braided into fertile yet contested lands, there rose a city whose name endures in stone and clay. Lagash, today a series of mounds scattered across the desert near modern Tel al-Hiba, was never the largest of Sumer's cities, nor the most enduring. Yet in its walls and archives we encounter some of the earliest stirrings of reform, of written laws aimed at curbing corruption, and of rulers who sought, however imperfectly, to redefine justice. At the same time, Lagash was a city perpetually scarred by war, its monuments bearing testimony not only to idealism but to bloodshed. The city reached prominence during the 3rd millennium, BCE. Archaeological remains tell us that Lagash encompassed a wide network of settlements, canals, and temple precincts, stretching over an area perhaps larger than any of its rivals at the time. Its kings styled themselves as servants of Ningirsu, the warrior god, whose great temple Eninu rose as a symbol of both piety and power. To rule Lagash was to govern not only through force, but through the rituals of divine sanction, offerings, and decrees issued in the god's name. Among Lagash's rulers, one figure stands apart, Uruk, who reigned around 2350 BCE. In an age when kingship was often expressed through conquest and displays of wealth, Urukagina's inscriptions reveal a different vision. Carved onto clay cones and tablets, his words describe reforms meant to limit the abuses of officials, restrain the power of the elite, and protect those most vulnerable in society. Widows and orphans, so often the overlooked victims of ancient economies, are explicitly named in his decrees. He sought to end the seizure of property by corrupt priests, to prevent the powerful from exploiting the weak, and to restore fairness to temple and palace alike. His proclamations are not laws in the later sense of codified codes, but they reflect a spirit of reform unparalleled in the early world. He ordered that the wealthy should no longer levy unjust taxes upon the poor, that temple administrators should not confiscate oxen and donkeys for their own gain, and that funerary offerings should no longer be extracted as burdensome fees. These acts, inscribed for posterity, suggest a king deeply aware of the fractures within his society. He cast himself as a shepherd, a protector of the commoner, a figure chosen by Ningirsu not for domination alone, but for the guardianship of justice. And yet, the reforms were not born in tranquility. Lagash was a city embattled, locked in ceaseless rivalry with its neighbor Umma. Between the two stretched the fertile but disputed fields of Guadana, a tract of land whose richness made it both coveted and contested. For generations, the conflict simmered and flared, punctuated by raids, treaties, and retaliations. The boundaries between Lagash and Umma were drawn, erased, and redrawn in blood. The most famous monument of this struggle is the Stele of the Vultures, a limestone slab erected by an earlier king of Lagash, Eannatum, around 2450 BCE. Its carved panels are among the earliest known depictions of organized warfare. On one side, soldiers march in tight formation, armed with spears and shields, advancing over the fallen bodies of their foes. On another, the god Ningirsu himself appears, seizing enemies in a vast net and striking them down as carrion birds circle overhead. It is from this grim imagery that the monument takes its name. The stele speaks not only of victory but of the sacred violence by which Lagash claimed legitimacy, the idea that war itself was sanctioned by the divine. This tension between reform at home and conflict abroad defines the paradox of Lagash. Urukagina's vision of justice unfolded in a world where warfare remained constant, where territorial disputes could not be solved by decree. While his inscriptions promise protection for the vulnerable, other texts recount battles with Umma, the destruction of canals, the plundering of fields. Justice within the walls of the city could not shield its people from the chaos that raged beyond. Archaeological finds from Lagash reflect this duality. Inscriptions speak of temple endowments, reforms, and legal concerns. Yet layers of burned debris and abandoned buildings hint at sudden violence, at times when warfare reached the very heart of the city. The cycle of building and destruction, reform and conflict is etched into its ruins. The same scribes who recorded decrees for fairness also carved accounts of military campaigns, of boundary stones raised and broken. And what of Urukagina himself? Despite his reforms, his reign ended in defeat. Lagash fell to Lugalza-Gazi of Umma, a rival who would soon go on to conquer much of Sumer before being overthrown in turn by Sargon of Akkad. The reformer king's decrees, so carefully etched into clay, could not withstand the tides of conquest. Yet their survival, buried in the soil, allowed later generations to glimpse a moment when a ruler sought something more than power, a moment when justice itself was imagined as part of kingship. The legacy of Lagash lies in this contradiction. It was a city where war and reform coexisted, where lofty ideals were carved beside accounts of slaughter. The stele of the vultures and the reform decrees together form a mirror, one reflecting humanity's drive for justice, the other its unyielding appetite for conflict. Both are among the earliest voices of civilization, whispering that the struggles we face today, between fairness and domination, peace and war, are as old as the first cities themselves. As we stand before these fragments in museums, reading the wedge-shaped marks upon stone and clay, we hear echoes of a society both familiar and alien. The widows and orphans of Lagash remind us of the human cost of inequality. The soldiers of the stele remind us of the price of conquest. And between them lies a question that remains unanswered. Can the ideals of justice endure in a world bound by power? Lagash does not give us certainty. It offers fragments of reform and fragments of war, preserved side by side. Its kings are long gone, its canals dry, its fields buried beneath dust. Yet its words, carved into clay more than 4,000 years ago, remain. They wait for us to listen, to wonder, to reflect upon the dawn of justice and the persistence of struggle. And in that silence, as the desert winds sweep over the mounds of Lagash, we sense that history itself is whispering, telling us that the search for justice is ancient, that the battle for fairness is unending, and that the ruins of the first cities still carry questions we have yet to answer. Chapter 7, the great ziggurats across the windswept plains of southern Mesopotamia, where the horizon is a line and the earth stretches out in every direction. Something remarkable rose against the flatness of the land. Out of mud and clay, the Sumerians built mountains. These were not mountains of chance or of geology, but mountains of intention, the ziggurats. To see one in its prime would have been to behold an axis mundi, a bridge between earth and sky, tier upon tier, rising in receding steps, each crowned by a shining temple at its summit. These structures drew the eyes of every inhabitant of the city, anchoring not just the landscape, but the cosmic order. The most famous of these monuments still stands today at Ur, though worn by 4,000 years of wind, rain, and conquest. Its massive mud brick core, faced with baked brick set in bitumen mortar, rises even now with a kind of stubborn endurance. Archaeologists have measured its base, nearly 64 meters long and 45 meters wide, and reconstructed its 3 great terraces, connected by staircases that once led priests and priestesses toward the heavens. In its original state, the ziggurat of Ur would have towered over the city, visible for miles across the desert, its upper shrine likely gleaming with paint or tiles, perhaps even gold. Yet Ur was only one among many. At Eridu, Nippur, Uruk, and Lagash, each major Sumerian city boasted its own ziggurat, dedicated to its own tutelary deity. These were not merely temples, but cosmic centers, each one a recreation of the primordial mound that, according to Mesopotamian myth, first rose from the chaotic waters at the dawn of creation. In this way, every ziggurat was a model of the universe, a reminder that the city was not merely a human settlement, but a divinely ordered space, with its god enthroned at the top of the stairway, receiving offerings, dictating fate. Excavations in the early 20th century revealed just how carefully these structures were built. Woolley's work at Ur uncovered layer after layer of construction, evidence of rebuilding by successive kings. Each generation did not simply repair what was broken. They buried the old ziggurat under clean fill and raised a new one on top, higher, grander, more aligned with their own vision of kingship. Inscriptions left by kings like Ur-Nammu proudly proclaim their dedication to restoring the sacred site and pleasing the moon god Nana. In this way, ziggurats were not static monuments but living projects renewed with each dynasty, embodying cycles of destruction, devotion, and rebirth. Scholars continue to debate their exact function. Some see them as temple platforms, raising the house of the god above the dust and floodwaters of the plain. Others suggest they served astronomical purposes, their elevated platforms allowing priests to track the movements of the stars and planets, so vital to Mesopotamian calendrical and astrological systems. There is even the possibility that they served a symbolic function more than a practical one, an earthly echo of the divine abode, a visual proclamation that here, in this city, heaven touched earth. To climb a ziggurat must have been an act of ritual significance. Each step was a movement upward, away from the dust of the mortal world, toward the purity of the divine realm. At the summit, in the small, secluded shrine, the high priestess might have met with the god in a sacred marriage rite, ensuring the fertility of the land for another year, or perhaps only offerings were made. Incense smoke rising from the platform to mingle with the winds, carrying prayers toward the heavens. Whatever the rituals entailed, the very act of ascending transformed the participant, marking a passage from the ordinary to the sacred. What is striking is how much effort was required to build and maintain these colossal structures. Each brick, millions of them, had to be shaped by hand, dried in the sun, and carried to the site. The organization of such labor speaks to the sophistication of Sumerian society. Administrators to tally the workers, scribes to record rations of beer and bread, overseers to direct the work crews. In a sense, the ziggurat was a testament to the power of the state itself, proof that the king could marshal the resources of an entire city to build something meant to last for eternity. But eternity in Mesopotamia was always provisional. Floods, erosion, and war could reduce a ziggurat to a heap of mud brick in a single generation. Perhaps this impermanence was part of the reason they were rebuilt so many times. Each reconstruction was both an act of piety and a political statement. The king was not just repairing a temple, he was restoring cosmic order, re-establishing the link between the human and the divine. Even in their ruin, the ziggurats retain their gravity. Standing before the ziggurat of Ur today, one can still feel the geometry of its power. The stairs, though broken, still beckon upward. The terraces still suggest ascent, and the summit, though empty, still seems to wait for the god to return. Some have wondered whether the ziggurat tradition left echoes in later myths. The Tower of Babel, described in Genesis as a tower that reached toward heaven, has often been linked to Mesopotamian ziggurats, particularly the great Etemenanki of Babylon. Was the biblical story a memory of one of these great towers, perhaps seen by exiles and remembered as a cautionary tale? The connection is tantalizing, reminding us how enduring the image of the step tower has been in the human imagination. As the sun sets over the ruins of Ur, the mud brick glows with a soft reddish light. Shadows lengthen across the ancient stairs, and the silence of the desert wraps itself around the monument. It is easy to imagine the sound of drums and chanting, the slow processions climbing toward the summit, the offerings laid before the god's image. The ziggurat was not merely a building, it was an experience, a point of contact between the earthly and the eternal. Today, only fragments remain, yet they are enough to stir the imagination. Each crumbling layer whispers of a world where kings built mountains to call down heaven, where cities were measured not just in walls and markets, but in their proximity to the divine. Perhaps that is why the ziggurats still hold such power. They remind us of humanity's oldest desire, to ascend, to bridge the gap, to stand at the meeting point of heaven and earth. And as we turn from the shadowed ruins of Ur to the next chapter of Sumer's story, we are left with a question that lingers in the evening air. Were these towers merely monuments of mud and brick, or did they truly once touch the realm of the gods? Chapter 8. The Epic of Gilgamesh. In the dim recesses of ancient libraries, pressed into clay with the sharp tip of a reed, lies humanity's oldest surviving epic. The tale of Gilgamesh, king, hero, wanderer, emerges from the dust of Mesopotamia as both myth and mirror, a story at once deeply rooted in the age of Sumer and yet universal to the human condition. Composed in fragments across centuries, woven from Sumerian poems into the grand Akkadian epic we know today, it remains one of the great treasures of world literature. Through its lines, we glimpse the fears, hopes, and questions of a civilization that lived more than 4,000 years ago. And though the tablets are cracked, incomplete, and scattered across the collections of the world, their voice has never fallen silent. The figure of Gilgamesh was not merely invention. He appears on the Sumerian King List as a ruler of Uruk, reigning sometime around 2800 BCE, though the length of his reign is shrouded in exaggeration. Over time, the memory of a historical king fused with mythic proportions. Later generations transformed him into a hero 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, whose strength was unmatched and whose authority extended beyond the walls of Uruk. In this merging of history and legend, Gilgamesh became an archetype, the flawed ruler who must learn wisdom through suffering, the restless man who confronts the inevitability of death. The epic as we know it comes primarily from the standard Babylonian version, compiled around the 12th century BCE and preserved most fully in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. When British excavators unearthed those tablets in the mid-19th century, they uncovered not only a forgotten story, but a flood narrative strikingly similar to that of the Hebrew Bible. News of this discovery sent shockwaves through Europe, challenging perceptions of scripture and raising questions about the deep well of shared tradition in the ancient Near East. Yet beyond its parallels, the Epic of Gilgamesh speaks with a voice uniquely its own, echoing across millennia with themes of friendship, grief, and the longing for eternity. The story begins in Uruk, where Gilgamesh rules with a heavy hand. His people cry out to the gods, who in their mercy create a rival to temper his power. Enkidu, a wild man born of the steppe, covered in hair, living among gazelles. At first, Enkidu embodies nature unshaped by civilization, but through the intervention of a temple woman, he is drawn into the human world, washed, clothed, and taught to eat bread and drink wine. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu meet, they wrestle fiercely, shaking the very foundations of Uruk. Yet instead of enmity, they find friendship. Their bond becomes the heart of the epic, a companionship that propels them into the wider world in search of glory and meaning. Together they embark on their most daring quest, to the distant cedar forest, guarded by Humbaba, a monstrous being appointed by the gods. The journey across deserts and mountains is one of mythic scale, echoing ancient Mesopotamia's sense of the world as a vast and perilous place, bordered by forests, seas, and realms of the unknown. When they confront Humbaba, it is with courage, but also with divine aid. Slaying the guardian, they cut down the cedars, felling a tree of cosmic significance. This act is at once triumph and transgression, and it foreshadows the tragedies yet to come. Upon their return, Gilgamesh attracts the attention of the goddess Ishtar, who offers him her love. When he rejects her, listing the fates of her previous lovers, she unleashes the bull of heaven upon Uruk. Again, Gilgamesh and Enkidu stand together, slaying the beast. Yet this defiance of divine will brings swift punishment. The gods decree that Enkidu must die. His decline is long and bitter, his visions of the underworld haunting, his laments heavy with despair. For Gilgamesh, the death of his friend is the turning point. No longer is he the proud ruler seeking glory. Confronted with loss, he becomes the wanderer, driven by a desperate question. Can death itself be escaped? Thus begins the second half of the epic, a journey unlike any other in ancient literature. Gilgamesh roams the wilderness in animal skins, driven by fear of mortality. He seeks out Utnapishtim, the distant survivor of the Great Flood, granted immortality by the gods. The parallels to the biblical Noah are unmistakable. Utnapishtim tells of how he was warned by Ea, how he built a vast boat, how the floodwaters engulfed the world, and how the vessel came to rest upon a mountain when the waters receded. He released birds to test the earth just as Noah did. This shared story, preserved across cultures, suggests a memory so deep it may trace back to real floods that swept the Mesopotamian plain. But Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh no escape. Eternal life, he tells him, is reserved for the gods. Human destiny is to live, to love, to build, and to die. Yet he offers a challenge. To stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, a test Gilgamesh fails almost instantly. As consolation, Utnapishtim reveals a secret plant that restores youth. Gilgamesh retrieves it, only to lose it to a serpent while bathing on his journey home. Even in victory, mortality reasserts itself. He returns to Uruk, not immortal, but transformed. Gazing upon the great walls his people have built, he realizes that legacy endures not through eternal life, but through the works one leaves behind. The epic closes not with conquest, but with acceptance. Gilgamesh has not defeated death, but he has learned to live with its inevitability. It is a wisdom as relevant now as it was then. That friendship, grief, and mortality are the threads that bind humanity across all ages. What makes the Epic of Gilgamesh extraordinary is not only its narrative, but its survival. The tablets that carry it are fragmentary, scattered, and incomplete. Each new discovery reshapes our understanding. A missing line here, a new passage there. Every fragment adds depth to the story. In 2015, a previously unknown tablet fragment revealed more detail about Gilgamesh and Enkidu's encounter with Humbaba, showing a more complex moral tension in their actions. The epic is still alive, still unfolding as archaeologists and philologists piece together the words pressed into clay more than 3,000 years ago. And yet, vast collections remain untranslated. Thousands of tablets sit in museum storerooms, their cuneiform signs waiting to be read. Among them may lie further pieces of the epic, new hymns to its heroes, or forgotten stories of the ancient kings. The tale we know is already profound, but it is also incomplete. The voices of Uruk may still have more to tell. The Epic of Gilgamesh reminds us that literature did not begin with Greece or with Homer, but with Sumer and Akkad, with reed styluses and clay. It is the ancestor of all later epics, the first great poem to wrestle with the human condition. It speaks of friendship as sacred, of mortality as unavoidable, of the search for meaning as endless. Its flood story connects it to later traditions, hinting at deep reservoirs of shared memory across cultures. And its survival across millennia shows us the resilience of story itself, how words pressed into fragile clay can outlast empires. To read Gilgamesh today is to feel the breath of an ancient world, to walk with the king through deserts and forests, to mourn with him over Enkidu, to share his longing for immortality, and finally to stand with him upon the walls of Uruk, gazing out at the world as it is. It is to recognize that though we live in another age, the questions he asked are still ours. And as we turn from the tablets to our own lives, the epic leaves us with a lingering silence, an open-ended reflection that in the face of death, what matters is how we live and what we leave behind. The story is unfinished, as all stories are, awaiting the next fragment to emerge from the earth, the next voice to be heard. The clay remembers, and perhaps so too must we. Chapter 9. Sumerian gods and the divine assembly in the heart of Sumer, beneath the shadow of ziggurats and within the cool, dim interiors of mud-brick temples, the voices of the gods were thought to resound. Every city had its patron deity, every household its guardian spirit, every field and river its divine overseer. The Sumerians lived in a world that was not merely observed by the divine, but saturated with it. A cosmos where the movements of the heavens, the rise of the river, and the fate of kings were all guided by an unseen council. This council, the divine assembly, was a celestial mirror of earthly kingship, a gathering of gods who met to decree the destiny of both mortals and the natural world. At the center of this pantheon stood Anu, the remote sky god, the lord of the heavens. He was the king of the gods, the one who granted authority to rule. Yet his presence was distant, abstract, more a principle than a personality. Beneath him sat Enlil, the god of air and storm, whose temple at Nippur was considered the true spiritual center of Sumer. Enlil was the one who carried out the decrees of heaven, often with terrifying force. The myths tell us he could grant kingship, but also unleash floods or famine if humans transgressed the divine order. Then there was Enki, lord of the subterranean waters, the clever god of wisdom and craft. His temple at Eridu, one of the oldest ritual centers in Mesopotamia, was the place from which he dispensed knowledge, magic, and the arts of civilization. Enki was known for his cunning, often acting to save humanity from Enlil's harsher judgments. In the myth of the flood, it is Enki who secretly warns the chosen human, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim depending on the version, instructing him to build a boat and preserve life. Through Enki, the Sumerians imagined that compassion and intelligence could temper the severe decrees of fate. Inanna, fierce and radiant, was the goddess of love, war, and kingship, her cult the most widespread of all. Her temple complex at Uruk, the Iana precinct, was a city within a city, filled with shrines, storage rooms, and processional ways. Her hymns describe her descending to the underworld, stripping away her powers one by one at each gate, only to return again, renewed. She was a paradoxical figure, both life-giver and bringer of destruction, a patroness of sexuality and fertility, but also of the battlefield. Through Inanna, the Sumerians expressed the volatile, untamed forces of existence itself. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, presided over birth, mountains, and the generative power of the earth. In the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, she heals the wounded god by creating new deities from the pains in his body, turning suffering into fertility. She represented a more grounded maternal presence among the often tempestuous divine assembly, a reminder that the Sumerian cosmos was sustained by both struggle and nurture. What makes these deities so compelling is how vividly human they seem. They argued, feasted, took offense, and made alliances, their divine council reflecting the courts of kings and city rulers. The Sumerians projected their political reality into the heavens, imagining that the fate of nations was debated not just in royal palaces, but in the great assembly of the gods. Decisions were made, destinies fixed, and sometimes, if the right rituals were performed, or the right prayers offered, perhaps altered, the oldest myths we possess, preserved on clay tablets, some dating to the late 3rd millennium BCE, are surprisingly cosmic in scope. The Enuma Elish, though later preserved by the Babylonians, may preserve Sumerian antecedents in which the world emerges from the mingling of primeval waters. The gods separate heaven from earth, establish the seasons, assign each deity their domain. In these narratives, creation is not a single moment, but an ordering of chaos, a setting of boundaries. The divine assembly becomes the guarantor of this cosmic order. Archaeologists and philologists have worked for more than a century to piece together these stories from fragmentary tablets. Many were first discovered in the libraries of Mesopotamian cities, in Ashurbanipal's royal library at Nineveh, at Uruk, Nippur, Sippar. But others have turned up in private archives, temple storerooms, even merchants' houses. Each new tablet brings new lines, new variations, revealing a tradition that was fluid, retold across generations, its meanings shifting like the rivers that nourished the land. Scholars debate the origin of the Sumerian gods. Some see them as anthropomorphic personifications of natural forces, storm, sky, water, fertility, gradually elaborated into mythic personalities. Others suggest they encode a deeper, almost historical memory, perhaps of early rulers or priestly lineages later deified. And there are those who see in the great spans of time given to the earliest kings and gods a symbolic system, a way of expressing cycles of time we no longer fully understand. Whatever their origin, The divine assembly functioned as the moral and metaphysical framework for Sumerian life. Kings derived their legitimacy by claiming divine appointment. Wars were waged with the gods' favor invoked. When disaster struck, whether by drought, invasion, or epidemic, it was interpreted as a sign that something had gone wrong in the relationship between humans and their divine patrons. Priests and diviners were tasked with reading omens, seeking to understand what decree had been issued from the council on high, and how it might be appeased. In the hush of temple courts, under starlit skies, rituals unfolded that were meant to bridge the mortal and the immortal. Hymns were chanted, incense burned, libations poured into the thirsty earth. One can imagine the solemn processions ascending the ziggurat steps, bearing offerings of bread, beer, and sacrificial animals. These were not mere acts of piety, but negotiations, petitions to a divine council whose decisions were thought to shape the very destiny of the world. The myths, however, retain a curious power even now. Inanna's descent to the underworld reads almost like a psychological journey, an archetype of death and rebirth. The myth of Enlil and Ninlil, in which the storm god's transgression leads to a cycle of banishment and forgiveness, echoes with themes of justice and restoration. These are not merely stories about gods, but about the human condition, about loss, renewal, and the search for meaning in a world governed by forces beyond comprehension. As we read these texts today, we face the same mystery that confronted their first interpreters. Are these merely poetic allegories? Or do they preserve, however dimly, a record of events and experiences that truly shaped the deep past? Did the Sumerians imagine their divine council purely in metaphor? Or did they believe, as they seem to have done, that real, personal powers convened in the heavens to decree the fate of kings and farmers alike? The tablets leave the question open. What they offer instead is a window into a mindscape where the divine was never distant. The gods were immediate, present in the dust storms, in the night sky, in the rise of the rivers. And the divine assembly, that council of great gods, was the highest court of all, its decrees binding, its judgments final, yet sometimes, just sometimes, swayed by the prayers of mortals. And so, as we leave the shadow of the temples and let the sound of those ancient hymns fade into the desert wind, we are left with a thought that lingers like incense. Perhaps the council is still there, somewhere beyond sight, still convening, still deciding, still shaping the story of humankind. Chapter 10. The invention of the wheel and the plough-in. The fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, where mud and reeds shaped the daily lives of the first city dwellers, a quiet revolution unfolded. It was not a battle, nor the rise of a new dynasty, but the birth of ideas that would forever alter the course of human civilization. The wheel and the plough, two inventions so elemental to our world that their origins are often taken for granted, emerged here, in ancient Sumer, as if gifted from the very soil itself. Archaeologists trace the wheel's first appearance to the late 4th millennium BCE, around 3500 BCE, in the land of southern Mesopotamia. The earliest images of wheeled vehicles appear on clay tablets and in cylinder seal impressions, small, detailed carvings rolled across wet clay. One seal from the city of Uruk depicts a cart drawn by animals, its solid wooden wheels turning on an axle. These are among the earliest echoes of a technology that would spread outward, across continents and centuries, until it became inseparable from human progress. Equally transformative was the plough. Before its invention, farming was done with simple digging sticks and hoes, straining human backs against the stubborn earth. In Sumer, sometime around 4000 BCE, farmers began fitting a wooden blade to a frame, pulled at first by men and later by oxen. This simple shift multiplied the power of human labor, opening new possibilities for food production. As the plough cut lines into the dark soil of the alluvial plain, it carved too a deeper path into urban life surplus and statehood. Yet what is striking is not only that these inventions appeared, but that they appeared here, suddenly, fully realized, in the very cradle of cities. There are no clear precedents in earlier cultures. The potter's wheel, too, emerges in Sumer at this same time, its spinning disc transforming the way clay vessels were shaped. Together, the wheel, the plough, and the potter's wheel represent a cluster of innovations that seem almost too concentrated to be coincidence. Why Mesopotamia? Why this narrow window of time? The wheel, simple in form, is not simple in conception. To carve a circular disc, bore a hole for the axle, and align it so it rotates evenly requires more than brute craftsmanship. It requires abstract thought, the ability to imagine a continuous turning motion, a principle not present in nature in such form. Some scholars suggest the potter's wheel came first, teaching the lesson of rotation before it was applied to transport. Others propose that the need to carry heavy loads across muddy plains drove the innovation. Whatever the spark, the leap was immense, from dragging to rolling, from strain to efficiency. In the centuries that followed, wheeled carts and wagons became familiar across Mesopotamia. The earliest examples used solid wooden wheels, heavy but sturdy, cut from planks bound together. By 2000 BCE, lighter spoked wheels appeared, signaling a new era of speed and maneuverability. These would carry chariots into battlefields, and with them, empires would rise and fall. But it was here, in Sumer, that the first creak of the wheel on an axle broke the silence of prehistory. The plough, too, transformed life in ways that extended far beyond the furrows of the field. With oxen pulling, a single farmer could cultivate more land than ever before. Fields expanded, surpluses grew, and with them came the need for storage, trade, and record-keeping. Temples and storehouses swelled with grain, feeding workers who built the monumental ziggurats. Writing itself, born from the tallying of goods, was a response to the abundance made possible by the plough. Technology and civilization were braided together, each reinforcing the other. One artifact speaks to this shift with quiet power. A limestone relief known as the plough scene, discovered in the city of Ur. It shows a man guiding a plough drawn by oxen, the soil turning beneath the blade. Though small in scale, the image captures the essence of a transformation. Humanity harnessing animal strength, shaping the earth to its will. Such images remind us that behind the abstractions of progress were real men and women pressing forward under the Mesopotamian sun, their lives bound to the rhythm of invention. Yet there is also mystery. These technologies appear with a suddenness that leaves questions unanswered. Why do we not see earlier experimental stages of the wheel elsewhere? Why do the earliest true-wheeled vehicles belong to Sumer and not to the cultures of Anatolia or Egypt or the Indus Valley? Was there a forgotten precursor? A workshop of innovation now lost beneath the sands? Or was Sumer truly the singular birthplace of these tools that would reshape the world? Some researchers note that in the marshy lands of southern Mesopotamia, dragging loads across wet ground would have been exhausting, perhaps encouraging the search for alternatives. Others point to the density of urban life in cities like Uruk and Eridu, where demand for food, goods, and transport was uniquely concentrated. Necessity and imagination intertwined, producing something that had never before existed. But even so, the silence of evidence elsewhere leaves space for wonder. The impact of these inventions cannot be overstated. The wheel enabled trade networks to stretch further, armies to move faster, goods to be transported with efficiency. The plough turned agriculture from subsistence to surplus, making possible the great flowering of Sumerian culture. The potter's wheel allowed artisans to create vessels in forms more symmetrical, more numerous, and more refined. Together, they fueled the engine of urban growth. The rise of temples, the codification of law, the spread of writing, all stand upon the quiet foundation of these tools. And yet, we must remember that the Sumerians themselves did not see these simply as mechanical devices. For them, every tool, every act of cultivation was bound to the gods. In Sumerian myth, it was the god Enlil who bestowed the plough, a gift to help humanity wrest food from the soil. Hymns praise the black-headed people of Sumer as those who first received the divine favor of agriculture. Even the wheel appears in sacred contexts. The chariot of the gods, pulled by mythical beasts, rolling across the heavens. To invent was, in their eyes, to participate in the unfolding order of the cosmos. Today, when we turn the wheel or guide the plough, we trace echoes of those first experiments on the Mesopotamian plain. The roundness of the wheel, the cut of the ploughshare, the spinning of the potter's disc, each carries within it the memory of a forgotten dawn. What began as timber and clay has become the unseen architecture of modern life, still turning, still cutting, still shaping. But the question remains, why here? And why then? Was it simply the convergence of environment and necessity? Or was there something more elusive, a spark of genius in the Sumerian mind, a forgotten teacher, or even a fragment of knowledge carried from an earlier age now lost to history? The ruins do not answer. They lie half buried, their tablets broken, their carvings weathered by time. Yet the silence invites reflection, for in the wheel and the plough we glimpse not only the beginning of technology, but the enduring mystery of human invention itself. And as we move forward in this journey through Sumer, the echoes of those first creaking carts and furrowed fields remind us that every step of civilization rests upon questions we have yet to fully answer. Chapter 11. The Rise of Akkadin. The middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, the flat, fertile plains of Mesopotamia were no strangers to war. For centuries, the Sumerian city-states had competed for dominance. Ur against Lagash, Umma against Uruk, their kings fighting, building walls, signing treaties, and tearing them apart again. But sometime around 2334 BCE, a new power emerged from the north that would change Mesopotamia forever. Its leader was Sargon, remembered in later tradition as a man of humble birth, who rose from obscurity to carve out the world's first empire. According to legend, Sargon was set adrift as an infant in a basket of reeds on the Euphrates, only to be rescued and raised by a gardener. Later inscriptions claim that the goddess Ishtar favored him, granting him kingship. Whether myth or memory, this story became central to his legacy, framing him not just as a conqueror, but as a chosen figure. Archaeology has uncovered his name, Sharukin, meaning the true king, inscribed on foundation tablets, victory steles, and dedicatory inscriptions that speak of his campaigns stretching from the Persian Gulf to the distant lands of the Mediterranean. The city he built, Akkad, Agade in the texts, remains a mystery to this day. Its exact location has never been found, though scholars believe it lay somewhere near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates. From this lost capital, Sargon ruled over a vast realm, a network of cities, canals, and territories unlike anything the world had seen before. He appointed governors to oversee distant regions, established standardized weights and measures, and ensured that his language, Akkadian, spread across Mesopotamia, slowly supplanting Sumerian as the language of administration and diplomacy. The art of this period reflects a blending of traditions. Cylinder seals from the Akkadian era show bold, dynamic scenes of kings in heroic combat, standing before the gods, or smiting enemies. A shift from the more restrained, ceremonial depictions of earlier Sumerian art. The famous bronze head from Nineveh, thought by many to represent Sargon or his grandson Naram-Sin, is a masterpiece of ancient metallurgy, its carefully rendered beard and piercing gaze, a testament to the sophistication of Akkadian craftsmanship. Sargon's campaigns pushed the boundaries of Mesopotamian influence outward. His inscriptions boast of crossing the Lower Sea, the Persian Gulf, and washing his weapons in its waters. He claims to have subdued the lands of Elam to the east and marched to the cedar forests of Lebanon in the west. Whether these accounts are literal or partly symbolic, they paint a picture of a ruler who saw no city as beyond his reach. For the first time in history, a single authority attempted to impose order over the patchwork of Mesopotamian states, creating what could rightly be called an empire. But such power came at a cost. In uniting the city-states, Sargon disrupted the delicate balance of local autonomy and ancient traditions. Revolts flared during his reign and those of his successors. Clay tablets describe uprisings that had to be brutally suppressed, rebellious cities whose walls were torn down. Yet the empire endured for nearly a century, passed to Sargon's sons Rimush and Manishtushu, and later to his grandson, Naram-Sin, the so-called King of the Four Quarters. Naram-Sin's reign represents both the zenith and the beginning of the unraveling of Akkadian power. His victory stele, carved in limestone and now displayed in the Louvre, shows him wearing a horned crown, a symbol previously reserved for the gods, as he ascends a mountain, trampling his enemies beneath his feet. It is a striking image of divine kingship, but later scribes remembered this act as hubris. In their accounts, Naram-Sin's impiety provoked the gods, who in turn sent down calamities upon Akkad. What followed has been described in some of the most haunting texts of Mesopotamian literature, the Curse of Akkad. This composition, written centuries after the empire's fall, tells of how the great city of Agade was abandoned, its fields turned to dust, its people starved and scattered. The storm took away its kingship, the text laments. Like a roaring lion, it completely devoured it. Archaeological evidence seems to support at least part of this narrative. Layers of windblown sand and abandoned settlements point to a period of severe drought and social collapse near the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. The final blow may have come from outside. The Guti, a mountain people from the Zagros range, descended upon Mesopotamia, toppling what remained of Akkadian authority. For nearly a century, they ruled the land, remembered by later scribes as a dark time when they knew no reverence for the gods. The empire that had united Sumer and Akkad was gone, leaving behind only ruins, scattered inscriptions, and memories of a golden age turned to dust. Yet the legacy of Akkad endured. Its administrative systems influenced the city-states that followed, paving the way for the rise of Ur III and later Babylon. Its language, Akkadian, became the lingua franca of the Near East for over 1,000 years, preserved in thousands of clay tablets from Mari, Ebla, and Amarna. Its myths, including the heroic narratives of Sargon and Naram Sin, were copied and retold long after the empire itself had vanished. Standing at the threshold of Akkad's story, we find ourselves looking at the first experiment in empire building, an experiment that brought both unity and unrest, progress and catastrophe. We see the grandeur of its art, the reach of its kings, and the fragility of the system they created. And as the texts of the Curse of Akkad whisper from their clay surfaces, we are reminded of the ancient belief that no city, no empire, no king, however mighty, could stand forever against the decrees of the gods. The ruins of Akkad have not yet been found. Somewhere, beneath layers of alluvium and centuries of silence, its walls still sleep. Perhaps one day they will be uncovered, and we will walk its streets again, reading its story where it was first written. Until then, Akkad remains both a fact of history and a ghost, the first empire and the first to fall. Chapter 12. Gudea of Lagashamid. The fading light of Sumer's long history. There rose a ruler whose memory still lingers with unusual clarity. His name was Gudea, Ensi of Lagash, a leader whose reign around the 22nd century BCE shines as a last golden age before the tides of later empires swept across Mesopotamia. Unlike the warlords who carved power through conquest, Gudea is remembered as a builder, a restorer, and a servant of the gods. His legacy survives not only in broken walls and silent ruins, but in the remarkable statues and inscriptions that carry his presence into our own time. The statues are unlike anything else from the ancient Near East. Carved from diorite, a dark and nearly unbreakable stone, they portray Gudea seated or standing, his hands clasped in perpetual devotion. His garments are simple, his posture serene, his features rendered with an idealized calm. More than 24 of these statues have been recovered, many unearthed at the site of Tello, the ancient city of Lagash. Together, they create a portrait of a ruler who wished to be remembered not as a warrior, but as a man of piety and vision, forever in communion with the divine. From his inscriptions we learn that Gudea dedicated himself above all to the god Ningirsu, the warrior deity and patron of Lagash. The texts tell us of a dream, in which the god appeared and instructed Gudea to rebuild his temple, the great Ininu, known as the house which rises like the white thunderbird. This vision became the cornerstone of Gudea's reign. He summoned workers, artisans, and architects, and he reached far beyond the borders of Sumer to gather the materials worthy of a god's dwelling. The inscriptions read almost like chronicles of global trade. Gudea boasts of cedar wood brought from the mountains of Lebanon, diorite carried from distant Oman, copper from Magan, gold from Anatolia, and precious stones from the eastern deserts. Each substance, each gleaming material, testified to the wide horizons of Sumerian commerce and the devotion of Lagash's ruler to fulfill his sacred charge. To rebuild a temple was not merely architecture, it was the reordering of the cosmos, the renewal of the bond between gods and men. Archaeological evidence at Tello confirms the scale of these undertakings. Foundations and temple remains suggest a vast complex, complete with courtyards, shrines, and storerooms. Hymns dedicated to Gudea describe rituals performed in the newly built temple, where music, incense, and offerings bound the people of Lagash to their god. One inscription tells of a festival lasting 7 days, where food and drink were distributed to the people, echoing the generosity of a ruler who saw his prosperity as a reflection of divine favor. Yet Gudea was not only a builder of temples, he was also a steward of justice. His inscriptions emphasize care for the weak, protection for widows and orphans, and fairness in temple administration. Though the details are often veiled in the formulaic language of kingship, we catch glimpses of a ruler seeking to temper the corruption and abuses that had plagued earlier reigns. In this, he seems to follow the spirit of earlier reformers like Uruk, another NC of Lagash, but Gudea's approach was suffused with a deeply religious tone, linking governance inseparably with service to the gods. The diorite statues themselves tell part of this story. Many bear inscriptions on their robes, recording prayers, temple dedications, or accounts of construction projects. Unlike the towering reliefs of kings smiting enemies or boasting of conquest, Gudea's monuments speak with quieter strength. They do not glorify war, but devotion. They do not boast of foreign lands subdued, but of temples raised and rituals performed. Through these works, Gudea fashioned his legacy in a way that was profoundly distinct from his contemporaries, and, yet, there is another dimension to his reign that invites reflection. The sheer detail of his inscriptions, the lists of materials, the rituals described, the hymns preserved, make Gudea's era one of the best documented periods of Sumerian history. We read of boats sailing up the rivers laden with stone, of artisans shaping copper into sacred vessels, of processions carrying statues of the gods. The texts bring us as close as we can come to standing within a Sumerian city at its height, hearing the songs of the temple, watching the smoke rise from the altars. It is as though Gudea's devotion preserved a snapshot of a world already nearing its twilight. For historians, this abundance of detail raises questions. Why did Gudea emphasize piety and building rather than conquest? Was it a personal disposition, or the necessity of a city too small to dominate by arms, finding instead its greatness in devotion? The records are silent on military campaigns, though Lagash was never free from the pressures of neighboring powers. It seems that Gudea chose a different path, cultivating legitimacy through divine favor and monumental works rather than through war. His reign, however, was not isolated from the larger currents of history. Beyond Lagash, Mesopotamia was shifting. The great Akkadian empire of Sargon had already risen and fractured. City-states jostled for position, alliances formed and dissolved, and new dynasties stirred on the horizon. Within a century, the dynasty of would rise, establishing the third dynasty of often called the Neo-Sumerian period. Against this backdrop, Gudea's Lagash feels like a final flourishing of pure Sumerian tradition before new powers remolded the land. The statues, now scattered across museums from Paris to Istanbul, are more than art. They are voices that survived. When we gaze into the carved eyes of Gudea, smoothed by centuries yet still serene, we are looking into the intention of a man who wanted to be remembered, not as a conqueror, but as a servant of the divine order. He reminds us that even in the tumult of shifting empires, there were rulers who sought legitimacy not in bloodshed, but in devotion and construction. Still, the silence of the ruins leaves questions that cannot be fully answered. Was Gudea truly as pious and benevolent as his inscriptions claim, or was this an image carefully crafted for posterity? Did his people see him as the ideal ruler he aspired to be, or were there undercurrents of struggle hidden beneath the hymns? As with so many figures of the ancient world, the line between devotion and propaganda remains blurred, suspended in the space between stone and silence. What is clear is that Gudea's reign stands as one of the last bright notes in the Song of Sumer. His temples rose as the land around them grew restless. His statues endured as the cities shifted and fell. In his devotion, we glimpse the heartbeat of a culture that knew its time was fading, but still sought to leave behind something eternal. And so, when we walk through the halls of museums and stand before his diorite forms, we are not only encountering a ruler, but the memory of a civilization in its final bloom. Gudea of Lagash remains, hands folded, eyes lifted, carved in unyielding stone as both a ruler of his people and a witness to the last golden light of Sumer. Chapter 13. The Third Dynasty of Urin. The centuries following the fall of Akkad, Mesopotamia entered a time of upheaval. The once great cities of Sumer lay fractured, ruled by local kings and foreign intruders, most notably the Guti from the Zagros Mountains. For generations, scribes would remember this as a time of chaos, when the gods had withdrawn their favor. And yet from this seeming darkness, a new light emerged. The Third Dynasty of Ur, known to history as Ur III. Around 2112 BCE, a ruler named Ur-Nammu seized power in the city of Ur, restoring order and inaugurating what many scholars call the Sumerian Renaissance. Under his leadership, the old traditions of Sumer were revived with renewed vigor. Ur-Nammu embarked on an ambitious building program, erecting grand temples and monumental structures that proclaim both his piety and his authority. The most enduring of these projects is the great ziggurat of Ur, its massive stepped form still dominating the desert today, a testament to the king who sought to reconnect heaven and earth. Ur-Nammu's reign is also remembered for one of history's earliest known legal codes. Carved into stelae and inscribed on clay tablets, the Code of Ur-Nammu predates even the more famous Code of Hammurabi by centuries. Its laws reveal a society striving for order and fairness, prescribing fines rather than death for many offenses, and laying out rules for marriage, property, and justice. This glimpse into the legal thought of the early 2nd millennium BCE shows a society attempting to bind itself together through shared principles, under the watchful eyes of the gods. When Ur-Nammu died, some say on the battlefield, power passed to his son, Shulgi, who reigned for an astonishing 48 years. It was under Shulgi that Ur III reached its peak. Shulgi portrayed himself not merely as a king, but as a divinely favored ruler, a poet, a warrior, and even a god in his own right. Hymns composed in his honor describe him as a tireless protector of Sumer, running from city to city to oversee justice, rebuilding temples, and performing sacred rites. Some texts even claim he completed a run of over 200 miles between Nippur and Ur in a single day, a feat meant to symbolize his superhuman dedication to the gods and his people. Administratively, Shulgi transformed his kingdom into one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic states the world had yet seen. The archives of Ur III, uncovered by archaeologists in sites like Drehem, ancient Puzurish Dagon, and Umma, preserve tens of thousands of tablets recording the movement of goods, taxation, labor assignments, and offerings to the gods. These documents allow historians to reconstruct the rhythms of everyday life. Herds of sheep being tallied for temple sacrifices, grain rations distributed to workers, and the delivery of copper, timber, and precious stones from distant lands. This level of control required an extensive network of scribes, governors and administrators, a true state apparatus. Shulgi fortified his empire's frontiers with a massive wall, known as the Wall of Martu, intended to keep out the Amorite tribes pressing in from the west. He established royal roads and way stations, enabling messengers to carry orders across the kingdom with unprecedented speed. These innovations bound together a realm that stretched from the head of the Persian Gulf deep into Mesopotamia's north, uniting once fractious cities under the rule of Ur. Yet, for all its achievements, the Ur III state carried within it the seeds of its own fragility. The bureaucracy, so effective in times of stability, became a heavy burden when times turned hard. As Shulgi's successors took the throne, pressures mounted. Tributary obligations weighed on subject cities. Drought and failing harvests appear in the record, shrinking the surpluses on which the state depended. Tablets from the reign of Ibi-Sin, the last king of Ur, speak of famine so severe that people sold themselves and their children into slavery to survive. External enemies sensed weakness. The Amorites, once kept at bay by Shulgi's fortifications, began to push into the heart of Sumer. To the east, the Elamites saw an opportunity and launched devastating raids. Around 2004 BCE, they captured Ur itself. The city was sacked, its temples plundered, and Ibi-Sin was carried away into captivity. With that, the last flowering of independent Sumerian civilization came to an end. The lamentations of the period capture the grief of a people witnessing the destruction of their world. In the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, a text likely composed shortly after the fall, the city itself is personified as a weeping mother. Ur is destroyed. Bitter is its lament. The temple is destroyed. Its lament is bitter. These haunting lines are not mere historical records, but expressions of cosmic despair, describing how the gods themselves had decreed the city's doom. And yet, even in ruin, Ur left an indelible mark. The administrative techniques pioneered in this period influenced later Mesopotamian states for centuries. The scribal schools of Ur preserved Sumerian language and literature, copying and recopying myths, hymns, and proverbs that might otherwise have been lost. Even as Akkadian became the dominant spoken tongue, Sumerian endured as a sacred language, the language of scholarship, ritual, and memory. Archaeology continues to illuminate this remarkable era. Excavations at Ur have revealed royal tombs, archives, and the foundations of Shulgi's ziggurat, its mud brick core still rising where it was laid 4,000 years ago. These silent ruins remind us that this was a civilization of staggering ambition, one that sought to weave the human and the divine into a single fabric of meaning, order, and destiny. The fall of Ur III did not erase Sumer's legacy, but it marked the twilight of its independence. In the centuries that followed, Mesopotamia would be ruled by outsiders, Amorites, Kassites, Assyrians, Babylonians, each leaving their mark upon the land. But the memory of Ur's kings, of Ur-Nammu's laws and Shulgi's hymns would echo through time, a final chorus of the world's first great civilization. Even now, standing before the ziggurat of Ur, one feels the weight of this memory. The wind sweeps across the ruins, carrying with it the voice of a people who dreamed of order in a turbulent world, who sang to their gods and raised monuments to the sky, and who, when their world fell, mourned it with a poetry so powerful that its echoes still reach us 4,000 years later. The sun sets slowly over the ruins, casting long shadows across the ancient bricks. The night gathers, and with it the sense that this was not merely the end of a kingdom, but the closing of a chapter in human history. And somewhere, beneath the sand, more tablets wait, voices still whispering from the final age of Sumer. Chapter 14, the Code of Ur-Nammuin, the ancient land of Sumer. Amid temples of baked clay and cities ringed with walls, there emerged not only the first great myths, but also the first experiments in order and governance. Long before Hammurabi's famous stele stood in Babylon, a king in the city of Ur sought to bind his people with something more lasting than conquest. His name was Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, and under his reign, sometime around 2100 BCE, humanity received one of its earliest written codes of law. The discovery of this code was piecemeal, like so much of Mesopotamian history. Fragments of tablets were unearthed in the early 20th century at Nippur, Sippar, and Uruk, inscribed with lines of Sumerian cuneiform. When pieced together, they revealed a text that scholars recognized as revolutionary, a structured set of legal principles, older by centuries than Hammurabi's codex. These fragile tablets carried within them the outlines of a civilization wrestling with questions of justice, order, and fairness. Ur-Nammu's laws, though incomplete in surviving form, speak with remarkable clarity. They addressed crimes of violence, theft, and marriage disputes, but rather than responding with brutality, they often prescribed fines and compensations. If a man caused injury, he paid with silver. If property was damaged, it was restored or reimbursed. Even in cases of more severe offenses, the emphasis leaned toward restitution over retribution. Only the gravest acts, such as murder or certain forms of adultery, were punished with death. This tone sets Ur-Nammu's code apart from later traditions, which often veered toward harsher measures. In Hammurabi's Babylon, centuries later, the laws would speak of an eye for an eye, prescribing retaliation in kind. By contrast, the Sumerian text reflects a worldview that sought balance through compensation, preserving social harmony rather than escalating vengeance. It suggests a society beginning to codify not only power, but mercy. The preface to the code, like so many Mesopotamian inscriptions, frames the laws as divine in origin. Ur-Nammu, it says, established justice by the command of Nanna, the moon god and patron of Ur. Law was not merely a human invention, but a reflection of cosmic order, sanctioned by the gods to ensure right conduct among men. In this way, every decree carried both civic and sacred weight. To obey the law was not only to serve the king, but to align with the will of the heavens. Among the surviving articles, we glimpse the texture of daily life. One law states that if a man divorced his wife, he must pay her silver, ensuring she was not cast aside without provision. Another decrees that if a slave married a free woman, their children would be considered free, an acknowledgement of dignity across social lines. Theft was punished with fines proportionate to the offense, suggesting an economy in which silver, not violence, mediated disputes. The humanity of these laws does not mean they were gentle by modern standards. The code reflects the hierarchy of Sumerian society, where men, women, slaves, and nobles stood in distinct ranks. Justice was often proportional to status. Yet within this framework, we find attempts to restrain abuses, to set boundaries on the powerful, and to provide recourse for the vulnerable. In a world where rulers boasted of crushing enemies and enslaving cities, the decision to write laws that protected widows, regulated marriage, and valued restitution is deeply significant. For archaeologists and historians, Ur-Nammu's code represents more than a set of rules. It marks a turning point in human thought. Oral customs had long governed communities, but writing them into fixed form transformed them into enduring institutions. Once inscribed on clay, law became a shared reference point, no longer subject only to the memory of elders or the whim of rulers. In this way, Ur-Nammu's tablets are among the earliest foundations of governance as we know it. The setting of these laws within the broader achievements of the third dynasty of Ur adds further weight. Ur-Nammu himself is remembered as both conqueror and builder. He raised the great ziggurat of Ur, whose massive terraces of mud brick still rise above the desert. He restored temples across Sumer and established a centralized administration that sought to unify the fractious city-states. The Code of Laws was part of this vision, a tool of unity, binding diverse peoples under a shared system of justice. Yet the code's survival is fragmentary, like the memories of Sumer itself. Only about 40 laws have been recovered, etched onto broken clay tablets. Scholars believe the full text may once have contained more than 50 or 60, perhaps inscribed on a single stele or housed within temple archives. The gaps leave us wondering, what provisions have we lost? What voices of the vulnerable, what safeguards of justice remain buried beneath the sands? Still, even in its incomplete form, the code reshapes our understanding of early law. It reveals that the impulse to regulate violence, to protect the weak, and to enshrine fairness in writing arose not in the later grandeur of Babylon, but earlier in Sumer's twilight. It is a reminder that civilization's first laws were not only about punishment, but about balance, seeking to weave fractured communities into a fabric of order. For the Sumerians, law was inseparable from cosmic harmony. Their myths told of the me, the divine decrees that governed existence, from kingship and crafts to music and justice. In setting laws to clay, Ur-Nammu was participating in this sacred tradition, inscribing fragments of cosmic order into human society. To read his code today is to hear an echo of that ancient desire, to create a world in which power bowed, at least in part, to principle. And yet, as with so much of Sumer's story, the ending is shadowed. Within a century of Ur-Nammu's reign, his dynasty would falter, pressed by invasions from Elamites and Amorites. The ziggurats crumbled, the cities fell silent, and the tablets of law lay forgotten. But the idea endured. Centuries later, Hammurabi's stele would stand in Babylon, and through it, the world would remember the Mesopotamian gift of law. Behind that legacy, though often overlooked, lies the quieter figure of Ur-Nammu, the king who first set justice into writing. The code remains incomplete, its clay fragments fragile. Yet within those broken lines is a vision of humanity reaching beyond vengeance, toward restitution, balance, and fairness. It is a vision still unfinished, still whispered across time, reminding us that the pursuit of justice began not with power, but with a dream of harmony carved in clay. Chapter 15, Trade and Distant Connections. The cities of Sumer did not stand alone in their desert plain. They were not isolated islands of mud brick and reed, cut off from the world, but living nodes in a vast and complex web of exchange stretching far beyond the horizon. From the earliest days of Uruk and Eridu, Sumer's prosperity depended not only on the careful tending of its canals and fields, but on its ability to draw rare and vital resources from distant lands. resources that transform these cities into hubs of industry, ritual, and power. The alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia was rich in silt, but poor in almost everything else. There was no stone for building, no metal for tools, no hardwood for beams and doors. Everything had to be brought in. Archaeologists have pieced together the routes that supplied Sumer's needs. Copper from Oman, and perhaps even farther from Magan, diorite and hard stones from Arabia and Iran, precious cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon, and above all, the vivid blue lapis lazuli from the far-off mountains of Badakhshan in northeastern Afghanistan. Lapis was the jewel of Sumer, prized not only for its beauty, but for its association with the divine. It was carved into beads, amulets, and inlays, used to adorn statues of gods and kings. One of the most famous finds from the royal tombs of Ur, excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, is a lyre whose bull-headed soundbox is inlaid with lapis, shell, and red limestone, depicting mythic scenes of animals feasting and serving at banquets. Each of these materials came from a different land, converging in Sumer to create an object of ritual power. The discovery of Indus Valley carnelian beads in Mesopotamian graves has provided some of the clearest evidence of far-flung exchange. These reddish-orange beads, crafted with a level of precision and polish unique to Harappan workshops, appear not only in royal burials, but also in administrative contexts, suggesting they were used in trade, diplomacy, or offerings. In return, Sumerian merchants likely sent wool textiles, grain, and silver, goods abundant in their cities but scarce along the Indus. Texts from the city of Ur mention merchants who travelled to Dilmun, Magan and Meluha, names scholars associate with Bahrain, Oman, and the Indus Valley. These texts are often terse and transactional, lists of goods, accounts of rations, names of sailors and officials, yet even in their dryness, they speak of journeys across seas and deserts, of ships laden with copper ingots and exotic woods, of long caravans crossing dangerous lands under the gaze of hostile tribes. The very existence of these texts hints at a surprising level of organization. Trade was not left entirely to individual risk-takers. It seems to have been overseen, at least in part, by temple and palace institutions. Merchants carried seals, small, intricately carved cylinders, that allowed them to mark goods and documents with their unique identity. Many of these seals depict scenes of ritual and myth, as if reminding the merchant that commerce was a sacred duty, overseen by the gods of justice and abundance. Beyond material goods, trade carried ideas. It is no coincidence that some of the earliest writing systems, weights and measures, and administrative technologies appear in multiple regions during the 3rd millennium BCE. The contacts between Sumer and its neighbours may have spread not only goods, but also techniques for accounting, craft specialization, and urban planning. Archaeologists have even found seals bearing Indus script symbols in Mesopotamian sites, raising questions about whether Harappan traders lived and worked among the Sumerians, and what languages they spoke when they met on the quays of Ur and Lagash. Sea travel was crucial to this network. The Persian Gulf acted as a natural highway, carrying goods between the cities of Sumer and the ports of Dilmun. Recent underwater surveys have located what may be the remains of ancient harbours and even shipwrecks, their cargoes still resting beneath the silt. The Sumerians' own depictions of boats show reed bundle vessels for local transport and larger, plank-built ships for overseas journeys, the forerunners of the great merchant ships of later millennia. There is also evidence that Sumer's trade connections reached into Anatolia, where silver and tin could be sourced. Tin was especially vital, for it was the ingredient that transformed copper into bronze, the metal that gave the Bronze Age its name. The flow of tin into Mesopotamia enabled not only the production of tools and weapons, but also monumental works of art, such as the copper statues of kings and deities that once gleamed in temple courtyards. Even the rhythms of Sumerian religious life reflected this web of exchange. Offerings to the gods often included materials brought from distant lands, reinforcing the idea that the king's power extended across the known world. When the priests of Nana, the moon god of Ur, laid out cedarwood, lapis, and gold before his statue, they were not merely making a local offering. They were reenacting a cosmic order in which the 4 quarters of the earth sent tribute to the divine center. And yet, for all its brilliance, this network was fragile. Climatic shifts, political turmoil, or the collapse of one link in the chain could disrupt the entire system. Some scholars believe that droughts or trade route disruptions contributed to the decline of Sumer in the late 3rd millennium BCE, as cities struggled to secure the resources they needed to survive. The fall of Ur III may have severed many of these connections, leaving the Gulf quiet for centuries before new powers restored its maritime roots. Today, as we hold a carved bead from the Indus or a lapis inlay from Ur, we are reminded that globalization is not a modern invention. 4,000 years ago, human hands were already passing these objects along trade routes that stretched for thousands of miles, connecting cultures that had never seen each other's cities, never spoken each other's tongues, but whose destinies were nevertheless intertwined. Standing in the museums where these artifacts rest, one senses that they still carry a trace of their long journey, across mountains, rivers, deserts, and seas, before coming to rest in a Sumerian temple, or a royal tomb, or now a glass case. They are fragments of a story that is still being pieced together, a story of connection that made the first civilizations possible, and somewhere, perhaps still buried in the sands of Dilmun, or beneath the waters of the Gulf, lies another tablet or seal impression, waiting to remind us that the world of Sumer was larger, more connected, and more mysterious than we have yet imagined. Chapter 16. The Enuma Elish in creation text in the heart of Mesopotamia, where rivers wound like veins through a land of clay and reed. Humanity's first cities rose, and with them, the first attempts to explain not only kingship and harvest, but the origins of existence itself. Among the fragments of broken tablets and temple hymns that have survived the millennia, there emerges a story at once mythic and profound. The tale of creation as envisioned by the Sumerians, and later woven into the grand Akkadian epic we now call the Enuma Elish. Though the Enuma Elish was compiled in the 1st millennium BCE, likely in Babylon during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar or his predecessors, it rests upon foundations laid centuries earlier in Sumerian hymns and theological texts. It is a tapestry stitched from older threads, carrying echoes of the world's first urban storytellers. The very opening words, "When on high," invite listeners into a time before time, when the universe had not yet taken shape, when only the primeval waters existed. The Sumerians too spoke of this beginning. Their hymns recall the mingling of primordial waters, the separation of sky and earth, and the emergence of order out of chaos. In their worldview, the sea was not only a physical boundary, but a living force, vast and unformed. From this abyss came the gods, embodiments of the natural world. An, the sky; Kai, the earth; Enlil, the storm and breath of life. These were not abstract concepts, but presences that shaped and sustained existence. The Babylonian Enuma Elish transforms these ideas into a drama of cosmic conflict. At its heart lies the figure of Tiamat, the monstrous sea, who rises in fury against the younger gods. She embodies chaos, the untamed forces of the deep, and her rebellion threatens the very possibility of order. It is Marduk, the champion of Babylon, who confronts her in battle. With his net and bow he slays her, splitting her body in two, the heavens fashioned from one half, the earth from the other. Out of destruction comes creation, out of chaos, cosmos. This tale of combat, of order emerging from the defeat of primordial forces, finds resonance across many traditions. In the Hittite myth of Illuyanka, in the Norse tale of Odin slaying Ymir, even in later echoes of the dragon subdued in biblical texts, we glimpse variations of this same motif. Was it coincidence, or the persistence of a deep cultural memory passed from one civilization to the next? Scholars continue to debate, yet the parallels remain striking. The Sumerians, however, offered a different emphasis in their earliest hymns. Their creation stories do not always hinge on battle. In some, the gods work together to bring forth life. Humanity itself is fashioned from the clay of the earth, mixed with the divine essence. In one hymn, the goddess Ninhursag, Lady of the Mountain, shapes the forms of men and women as a potter shapes vessels. In another, Enki, the god of wisdom and waters, molds humanity to serve the gods, to bear the burden of labor, and to sustain the temples with offerings. Here lies a profound insight into the worldview of these early city dwellers. For the Sumerians, humans were not the center of creation, but servants within a cosmic order. The temples they built, the rituals they performed, were acts of maintaining harmony between heaven and earth. Labor, toil, and worship were not burdens imposed unfairly, but essential to keeping balance with the divine. The Babylonian Enuma Elish echoes this theme, but shifts its focus. After Marduk slays Tiamat, he creates humankind from the blood of Kingu, her consort and general, who led her armies in rebellion. Out of the defeated rebels' life force, men and women are formed, not as equals to the gods, but as workers, destined to maintain temples and ensure the gods need never labor. The implication is clear. Humanity is born from the remnants of chaos, carrying within them both rebellion and service, both fragility and responsibility. For archaeologists, the survival of these texts is itself miraculous. Written in cuneiform on clay tablets, they endured where parchment and papyrus crumbled. Copies of the Enuma Elish were found in the Great Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, inscribed in the 7th century BCE. But their content points to traditions already ancient, drawing upon Sumerian hymns preserved for over 1,000 years in temple schools. Each fragment, each rediscovered tablet, is a doorway into how early civilizations sought to answer questions that remain with us today. Where do we come from? What is the purpose of our existence? The mythic imagery may feel distant, yet there are hints of something older still. Faint memories, perhaps rooted in prehistoric upheavals. The notion of a great watery abyss recalls the flooding of Mesopotamian plains, when rivers burst their banks and reshaped the land. The battle with Tiamat, the monstrous sea, might echo humanity's confrontation with forces of nature that seemed overwhelming and destructive. Even the act of shaping humans from clay may preserve a memory of mud and river silt, the very matter from which Sumerian cities were built. We cannot know whether these myths were purely metaphor, theology, or half-remembered accounts of real events reframed in sacred terms. Were they allegories of cosmic order, or cultural memories of floods, battles, and migrations transformed into timeless narrative? The ambiguity is part of their enduring power. What is certain is that these texts reveal the depth of imagination within the world's first literate cultures. In their hymns and epics, we glimpse a people who gazed at the world around them, the rivers, the storms, the stars, and sought to weave them into a coherent story. Their myths gave meaning to suffering, purpose to labor, and a framework to existence itself. And so the Enuma Elish and its Sumerian precursors remain more than ancient curiosities. They are windows into the dawn of thought, reminders that long before philosophy, before science, before modern religion, humanity's first cities were already asking questions that echo into the present. What is the nature of chaos? How does order arise? What role do we fragile mortals play in the vast design? As we read the broken lines of these clay tablets, we sense both clarity and mystery. The words are old, yet the questions are eternal. In the silence between the lines, in the spaces where the tablets have crumbled away, we hear the echoes of forgotten voices, priests chanting in dim temples, scribes etching signs by lamplight, storytellers weaving myths beneath desert stars. The Sumerians sought to understand their world through story, and the Babylonians preserved those stories in epic form. Yet even now, the deeper meaning remains elusive. Were these merely myths, or fragments of truths too vast for memory to hold? We cannot say. What we can know is that these creation texts carried the first great attempt of civilization to look beyond survival, beyond kingship, beyond the rise and fall of cities, to the mystery of beginnings itself. And like the rivers that once nourished Sumer, their stories still flow, carrying us back to the shadowed dawn of thought, where chaos and cosmos first intertwined, and the clay of humanity was shaped by unseen hands. Chapter 17. Cylinder Seals, Miniature Masterpieces. In the quiet halls of Sumerian archives, among clay tablets recording rations, taxes, and temple offerings, there exist objects that seem almost too delicate, too intimate, to have survived 4,000 years of history. Cylinder seals. These small, cylindrical stones, often no larger than a finger, were carved with astonishing precision, engraved with scenes that could be rolled onto clay to leave impressions of gods, humans, animals, and intricate patterns. What may appear, at first glance, as mere decoration was, in fact, a profound expression of personal identity, authority, and sacred symbolism, a way for the individual to leave a mark upon the eternal clay of the Sumerian world. The earliest seals appear in the late 4th millennium BCE, around the time when Uruk was emerging as the world's first metropolis. They were crafted from a variety of materials: limestone, hematite, carnelian, lapis lazuli, and even precious metals. The choice of stone itself carried meaning. Lapis, for instance, imported from the mountains of Badakhshan, connected the owner to distant lands and hinted at a certain prestige, while the use of locally quarried stones may have emphasized continuity with the land. Each cylinder, painstakingly engraved with fine tools, functioned both as a practical device and as a miniature work of art. To roll a cylinder across soft clay was to assert identity, to make a contract visible, to authenticate a document, or to seal a container. But the imagery on many seals goes far beyond administrative necessity. They depict processions of deities, worshippers bringing offerings, animals engaged in symbolic actions, and scenes that appear ritualistic, even cosmic. Some seals show figures climbing ladders or approaching a central divine figure, while others include crescents, stars, or what some scholars interpret as boats of the gods sailing across the heavens. These images hint at an understanding of the world that merged human, divine, and celestial realms, a cosmos in which even small objects could carry profound meaning. One of the most famous examples comes from the royal tombs of where seals were found placed beside their owners, sometimes still inside their jewelry or clothing. These artifacts suggest that seals were more than administrative tools. They were talismans, intimate possessions that traveled with their owner through life and eventually into death. The designs are so precise, so miniature in scale, that they require a careful, steady hand, often executed with the aid of magnification techniques that are lost to us now. Each line, each curve, bears the trace of the artisan's skill, the imagination of a society capable of thinking simultaneously about bureaucracy and mythology. The symbolism of these seals remains a source of fascination and debate. Some depictions are straightforward: a temple scene, a banquet, a king receiving tribute. Others, however, resist easy interpretation. A common motif shows a central figure surrounded by animals arranged in symmetrical patterns. Some scholars interpret this as an early zodiac or a cosmological map, a way of organizing the natural and divine worlds into a coherent order. The repeated appearance of celestial symbols, crescents, and stars has led to speculation that certain seals encoded astronomical knowledge or mythic narratives of creation. Yet no definitive interpretation exists, leaving the seals as miniature enigmas, objects whose full significance is tantalizingly just beyond our understanding. Cylinders also reveal the intersection of personal, political, and religious life in Sumer. Officials, priests, and merchants all used seals, and their designs often reflected their roles. A temple administrator might feature a god or ritual scene. A merchant might choose images of trade, animals, or offerings. Through these choices, the Sumerians made visible not only who they were, but what they believed, what power they commanded, and how they saw their place in the world. Even among the elite, seals were intensely personal. Two individuals might use the same general motifs, but the execution, the arrangement, the smallest details made each seal unique, a signature that could not be replicated. The act of sealing itself was imbued with ritual significance. When a seal was pressed into clay, it transformed the mundane into the sacred, connecting the human hand to the divine imagery engraved on its surface. These impressions might seal a contract, close a jar of grain, or mark a shipment of luxury goods traveling from Dilmun or Magan into the heart of Sumer. The seal was at once a tool of commerce and a bridge between worlds, the administrative and the cosmic, the temporal and the eternal. Modern scholars have attempted to categorize these seals by style, period, and iconography. The early Uruk style. Seals feature geometric designs and simple animals. By the time of the Akkadian and Thread periods, they become more narrative, depicting mythic scenes, ritual acts, and even heroic feats. Yet despite this scholarly effort, the deeper meaning of many seals remains elusive. Are some images purely decorative? Are others symbolic keys to religious rites long forgotten? Do they encode secret knowledge known only to the elite, or are they meant to communicate publicly? The answers are uncertain, leaving these objects suspended between practical use and artistic, spiritual expression. Even the smallest detail on a seal can hold significance. The way a figure's hair is arranged, the posture of an animal, the positioning of celestial symbols, all may have conveyed messages intelligible to a contemporary observer, yet opaque to us. The seals demand slow contemplation, a recognition that in Sumerian culture, meaning was layered, and the mundane and sacred were inseparable. Each impression is a microcosm of the world, ordered, symbolic, and yet enigmatic, as though the Sumerians compressed the cosmos itself into the curve of a tiny stone. Cylinder seals also highlight Sumer's connections to distant lands. Materials, like lapis from Afghanistan or carnelian from the Indus Valley, traveled thousands of miles before being engraved with intimate scenes. Even in miniature, these seals carry traces of a broader world, the same trade networks that brought timber, metals, and precious stones into Sumerian cities. In this way, a small seal is not just a personal mark. It is a relic of a global Bronze Age economy, a tangible intersection of local ritual and long-distance commerce. Today, as we handle or observe these tiny masterpieces in museums, we are drawn into the careful, deliberate world of Sumerian craftsmanship and thought. We see the tension between utility and beauty, between the everyday and the divine. Each cylinder seal reminds us that even the smallest object can carry immense significance, bridging the human and the cosmic, the temporal and the eternal, and that sometimes the most profound stories are told in miniature. The seals are silent, yet their impressions speak across millennia. They remind us that Sumerian society, with all its bureaucracies, temples, and kings, also valued the intimate, the personal, and the symbolic. They whisper of rituals performed in quiet chambers, of merchants sealing containers before long voyages, of priests invoking the gods through imagery rolled into soft clay. And they leave us with a lingering question. What other meanings, what other truths are hidden in the curves of these miniature masterpieces, waiting for those who take the time to look closely? Chapter 18, Nippur, the sacred center in the broad alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates wind through sun-baked soil. There lies a city whose significance was never measured by armies or palaces, but by the weight of the divine. Nippur, ancient home of the god Enlil, stands as the spiritual heart of Sumer. While cities such as Uruk, and Lagash contended for political dominance, Nippur remained untouchable in its sanctity, a center where heaven and earth met, and where kings, even the most ambitious, acknowledged the supremacy of the divine order over human authority. Excavations at Nippur, begun in the late 19th century by American and European archaeologists, have revealed layers upon layers of devotion. The Ekor, the great temple of Enlil, dominates the site. Though now reduced to fragments of mud brick and eroded foundations, its former scale is suggested by enormous platforms and terraces rising in stepped formation, each level representing centuries of construction, renovation, and religious care. Pilgrims, priests, and scribes once ascended these terraces in a rhythm of worship, bringing offerings and reciting hymns that resonated with the authority of cosmic law. Nippur's influence was not derived from conquest, but from its role as the spiritual arbitrator of Sumer. Kings sought the city's blessing to legitimize their rule, a practice attested in inscriptions across the region. Even the powerful rulers of Ur III, who forged a centralized state in the 21st century BCE, invested in rebuilding Nippur's temples, recognizing that authority granted without Enlil's endorsement carried no weight. It was in Nippur that divine sanction intersected with mortal ambition, a place where the ephemeral power of kings was tempered by the enduring presence of the gods. The scribes of Nippur were custodians of memory, cataloguing both the mundane and the transcendent. Tens of thousands of clay tablets have been unearthed from the city, containing a staggering breadth of knowledge. Administrative records, ration lists, and temple inventories sit alongside lexical lists, grammatical exercises, hymns, myths, and wisdom literature. These texts form the backbone of scribal education, passing from teacher to student in a continuity that endured across centuries. Even today, many of these tablets remain unpublished or untranslated, silent witnesses to a city that preserved Sumerian culture long after its political centers had waned. Among these tablets are the earliest literary works, hymns praising Enlil and his entourage of gods, and mythological texts that frame the universe in Sumerian thought. The god Enlil, often called the wind, the air, the breath of life, presided over creation, kingship, and the ordering of society. Nippur was his earthly seat, the axis mundi where his will was made tangible through ritual and construction. The city's sacred status, therefore, was not a symbolic gesture, but a functional reality. The administration of divine favor, the maintenance of cosmic balance, and the instruction of scribes who would carry knowledge far beyond the city's walls. The archaeological record offers glimpses into daily life intertwined with the sacred. Temple complexes were centers not only of worship, but of economic activity. Granaries, workshops, and storerooms surrounded the Ika, holding commodities and materials brought as offerings. Priests directed the redistribution of these goods, while scribes meticulously recorded every transaction. The material culture of Nippur, the baked bricks, clay figurines, and cuneiform tablets, reveals a city where the spiritual and administrative were inseparable. Here, devotion was measured in both ritual and record-keeping, a dual testament to order in the eyes of gods and men. The enduring prominence of Nippur also speaks to the persistence of religious tradition amidst political upheaval. While dynasties rose and fell, empires expanded and contracted, and neighboring cities waged war, Nippur's sanctity remained untarnished. Kings who conquered Ur or Lagash made offerings at Nippur. Even rulers from distant Akkad sought its blessing. This continuity suggests that, in Sumerian consciousness, sacred authority could outlast political authority, a principle echoed in the rituals and hymns preserved within its scribal schools. The textual archives further reveal the intellectual life that flourished within Nippur's walls. Lexical lists, often painstakingly copied, served as both educational tools and repositories of knowledge. They provide evidence of a civilization consciously reflecting upon its own language, categorizing the natural and social worlds in ways that would shape centuries of scholarship. Mythical texts, such as creation hymns and incantations, articulate the Sumerians' understanding of their universe, the separation of heaven and earth, the role of gods in shaping life, and the responsibilities of humans within that order. Through these writings, Nippur becomes more than a city. It is a lens through which the Sumerians interpreted existence itself. Even today, the city evokes a sense of quiet reverence. The ruins, half buried beneath the plain, yield fragments of temple walls and scattered bricks inscribed with divine names. When the wind sweeps across the site, it carries a faint echo of the prayers and hymns that once filled the air. The weight of millennia presses upon each surviving artifact, reminding us that Nippur's significance was measured not in conquest or wealth, but in devotion, continuity, and the careful transmission of knowledge. Yet questions remain, as they do with much of Sumerian history. How much knowledge has been lost to the sands, buried in the tablets that have yet to be discovered or translated? How did Nippur's scribal culture influence other cities and empires? And why did its sanctity endure so steadfastly, even as political centers shifted and declined? These mysteries linger in the silence between the ruins, suggesting a depth of spiritual and intellectual life that we are only beginning to grasp. Nippur, in its devotion to Enlil, stands as a testament to the human impulse to seek meaning beyond mere survival, to construct not only cities but worlds of order, ritual, and reflection. It reminds us that the greatest legacy of civilization is not always conquest or wealth, but the preservation of knowledge, culture, and sacred tradition. And in walking among the remnants of its temples, or tracing the marks of scribes on weathered clay, we sense a continuity that surpasses the ebb and flow of kingdoms. A sacred center that held together the memory of a civilization through centuries of change. Even now, as we piece together its story from scattered artifacts and partially deciphered tablets, Nippur whispers to us across time. It is a city where devotion dictated the rhythm of life, where the divine and human coexisted in daily practice, and where the written word became a vessel for culture, law, and myth. Its sanctity endures, not as a monument to power, but as a living echo of Sumerian thought, a place where the earliest humans sought to understand their place in a vast and mysterious universe. And so, As we leave the ruins of Nippur, we are reminded that sacred spaces are not always measured in stone or grandeur, but in their ability to preserve the intangible, faith, knowledge, and the quiet certainty that some centers of human civilization endure beyond politics, empire, and time. The city stands half hidden beneath the desert, yet its spirit remains, an open question for historians, archaeologists, and seekers alike, inviting reflection on the eternal interplay between the human and the divine. Chapter 19. The Sumerian Flood. Tablet buried for millennia within the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, a single clay tablet has captured the imagination of scholars and dreamers alike. The flood tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, unearthed in the 19th century at the site of Nineveh by excavators working for the British Museum. This fragmentary piece of baked clay contains one of humanity's earliest recorded accounts of a cataclysmic deluge, a flood so immense that it wiped out nearly all life, sparing only the divinely favored hero Utnapishtim, and the creatures he preserved aboard a massive vessel. The story unfolds with the gods convening in a council, their voices fierce and inscrutable, declaring their intention to destroy humanity. Utnapishtim, warned by the god Ea, receives precise instructions for building a boat large enough to house his family, artisans, and a selection of every living creature. Dimensions are given in cubits, compartments described, and a method for sealing the vessel explained with meticulous care. Once the storm descends, the waters rise for days and nights, engulfing the earth in a merciless flood. Finally, the rain ceases, the waters retreat, and the boat rests atop a mountain, a site of renewal and the beginning of a new human era. Archaeologists have marveled at both the specificity and the universality of this tale. The details of the ark, its construction, and the enumeration of animals evoke the administrative precision characteristic of Mesopotamian society. Yet the story's scale and terror are cosmic, touching on themes of divine judgment, mortality, and rebirth. Scholars have noted striking parallels to later flood narratives, most famously the story of Noah in Genesis, suggesting that the Mesopotamian flood tale profoundly influenced neighboring cultures. The similarities: a chosen survivor, a vessel carrying life through destruction, the resting of the boat on a mountain, the sending forth of birds to find land, are remarkable, yet subtle differences remain, hinting at the tale's original cultural and theological context. The tablet itself is fragile, written in cuneiform with careful, deliberate marks. Its language is Akkadian, the lingua franca of the Assyrian scribes who copied it, though the story's origins clearly trace back to older Sumerian traditions. Its preservation is as much a miracle as the story it contains. Over time, clay tablets would shatter, be buried under shifting sands, or crumble in floodwaters. Yet this fragment survived, offering a glimpse into the mind of a civilization preoccupied with the forces of nature, the will of the gods, and the fragility of human life. Some scholars have attempted to reconcile the flood tablet with geological evidence. Layers of river silt in southern Mesopotamia, dating roughly to 2900 BCE, suggest episodes of dramatic flooding, possibly severe enough to devastate settlements. While it is impossible to know if these events directly inspired the myth, the correlation is tantalizing. Perhaps generations of oral storytelling transformed real catastrophes into epic narrative, embedding the memory of catastrophe into the culture itself. Yet the story's enduring appeal lies not in literal history, but in its reflection of timeless human anxieties. Our vulnerability, our dependence on forces larger than ourselves, and our hope for renewal. Utnapishtim himself is a figure of fascination. He is both mortal and touched by divinity, granted immortality by the gods after surviving the flood. In the narrative, he recounts the event to Gilgamesh, the hero king, whose quest for eternal life drives him to seek wisdom beyond the boundaries of mortality. This framing creates layers of meaning. The flood is both an act of divine judgment and a parable of human striving, a reminder of mortality, resilience, and the possibility of transcendence. The human experience, caught between fear and hope, becomes the vessel in which the story moves, just as the ark carries life across turbulent waters. The narrative also carries subtle cosmological undertones. Stars, winds, and waters are not merely background elements. They are instruments of divine will, part of a universe where the natural and supernatural intertwine. Birds, released to find land, become agents of revelation, revealing the state of the world and signaling the cessation of divine wrath. Such details suggest that the story was not merely entertainment, but a means of understanding the cosmos, human destiny, and the delicate balance between human agency and divine decree. Over time, the flood tablet has fueled debates that stretch from archaeology to theology. Did a great flood actually occur in southern Mesopotamia? Was it a memory preserved through oral tradition and transmitted across generations? Or is it primarily allegorical, a reflection of existential anxieties and societal values encoded into a story of catastrophe and renewal? Each approach offers insight but also leaves questions unanswered, as if the tablet itself guards its secrets, allowing glimpses but never complete understanding. Beyond its scholarly significance, the tablet continues to inspire awe. The story of Utnapishtim has echoed across millennia, influencing not only biblical tradition, but literature, art, and collective imagination. Its power lies in its capacity to connect the distant past with universal human experiences. The fear of annihilation, the labor of survival, the hope of renewal, and the enduring struggle to find meaning in the face of forces beyond our control. Every line etched into the clay carries both historical weight and narrative resonance, a testament to the ingenuity and spiritual depth of Sumerian civilization. As we contemplate the flood tablet today, we see more than a myth. We glimpse a civilization grappling with the mysteries of life and death, the authority of the divine, and the precariousness of human endeavor. The waters of Utnapishtim's flood may have receded thousands of years ago, yet in the clay impressions, the story flows on, reminding us of the enduring human need to remember, to narrate, and to make sense of the forces that shape our world. The tablet rests now in a quiet gallery, shielded from the elements, yet in its silence, it speaks across time. It invites reflection, offering not a definitive answer, but a mirror to human experience, the fragility of life, the weight of divine judgment, and the hope that from destruction comes renewal. And in this space between myth and memory, between history and legend, the flood tablet continues its subtle, powerful testimony, a story of waters that once covered the earth, and of humanity's enduring will to endure. Chapter 20, Astronomy and the Heavens. Long before the invention of telescopes or the formulation of modern physics, the people of Sumer lifted their eyes to the night sky, and there they found both wonder and guidance. In cities of mud brick and reed, under the silent sweep of stars, priests kept vigil over the heavens, meticulously observing the movements of the moon, the planets, and the constellations. Their attention was not casual. It was deliberate, systematic, and sustained across generations, leaving behind clay tablets etched with records that reveal a civilization deeply attuned to the celestial rhythms above. At sites such as Nippur, and Babylonian successors like Sippar, archaeologists have uncovered early star catalogues, lunar calendars, and eclipse records. These texts, inscribed in cuneiform on baked clay, list the appearances of celestial bodies, the first risings of stars, and the periodic return of planetary cycles. The precision with which these observations were made suggests a remarkable familiarity with the sky. Priests recorded phenomena that could be predicted, such as the phases of the moon, while also noting rarer events like eclipses, comets, or unusual conjunctions. Each entry was both practical and profound, linking the mechanics of the heavens with the affairs of gods and men. The Sumerians' calendar, rooted in lunar cycles, guided not only agricultural activities, but also religious observances. Festivals, offerings, and temple rituals were timed according to the movements of celestial bodies. For instance, certain star risings marked the start of sowing or harvest, while planetary conjunctions were interpreted as portents of prosperity or misfortune. In this way, astronomy and spirituality were inseparable, and the night sky became both a clock and a divine canvas. Some scholars argue that the Sumerian sky-watching was primarily ritualistic. Each observation was a prayer, a divination, or a reading of the divine will. The movements of Enlil's or Nana's celestial manifestations were interpreted as messages from the gods, instructing rulers and priests alike in matters of governance, warfare, and the distribution of wealth. In this view, Sumerian astronomy is inseparable from theology. The heavens were not inert, but alive with divine presence, and each recorded event a sacred communication. Yet other evidence hints at a nascent curiosity that approaches proto-science. The repetitive tracking of lunar phases, the careful tabulation of planetary motion, and the recording of eclipse cycles indicate a desire to understand patterns in the cosmos. The priests of Sumer were not merely passive observers. They were analysts, compiling data and seeking consistency over time. The distinction between ritual and empirical investigation may not have existed as we define it today, yet it is clear that their meticulous records provided the foundation for later Babylonian and even Hellenistic astronomy. The Mul-Apin series, a set of star lists and celestial instructions compiled in later centuries, likely draws upon Sumerian prototypes. These tablets reveal constellations, the courses of the sun, moon, and planets, and instructions for calculating the timing of religious festivals. It is difficult to separate the spiritual from the empirical. The observation of stars was at once a practical matter, essential for agriculture and ritual, and a reflection of a broader cosmological vision, one in which every movement in the heavens mirrored, or perhaps influenced, events on Earth. Consider the Sumerian lunar calendar. Months were determined by the phases of the moon, and intercalary months were added to reconcile lunar and solar cycles. To achieve this, priests had to track celestial events across years, noticing discrepancies and predicting adjustments. In doing so, they were engaging in a form of systematic observation that required memory, measurement, and careful record-keeping. These techniques hint at the beginnings of mathematical astronomy, a discipline that would flourish in Babylon and beyond. Eclipses in particular fascinated the Sumerians. Tablets record the date, time, and position of solar and lunar eclipses, often linked to warnings or omens for kings. These records show awareness that such events were not random, but part of a cyclical pattern, even if the underlying mechanisms remained mysterious. To the Sumerian priest, the eclipse was both a spectacle of the heavens and a portent, a reminder that the cosmos was active, attentive, and intertwined with human fate. Yet, as we study these records, we are confronted with a profound question. Were the Sumerians primarily seeking knowledge, or were they seeking messages? Perhaps the answer lies in their dual purpose. By watching the skies, they both disciplined their understanding of time and expressed reverence for the divine. The act of observation itself was an act of devotion, and in this interplay of empirical recording and spiritual significance, we see a civilization negotiating the boundary between human curiosity and divine mystery. The physical remnants of this practice survive in the thousands of clay tablets scattered across museums and collections worldwide. Many remain unpublished or untranslated, their contents a hidden archive of centuries-long observations. Each tablet represents not only data, but also the continuity of a tradition. Generations of scribes copying, interpreting, and preserving celestial knowledge. Through them, we catch glimpses of an ancient world in which the stars were more than points of light. They were markers of time, guides for ritual, and symbols of cosmic order. Sumerian astronomy also influenced the social and political order. Kings relied on priestly readings of the heavens to legitimize decisions, time military campaigns, and schedule religious festivals. In this way, celestial knowledge became inseparable from authority. The movement of planets and stars was not mere decoration on the night sky, but a language through which the gods communicated the framework of society itself. By understanding the heavens, the Sumerians sought not only to predict events, but to align themselves with the rhythm of the cosmos. Despite the passage of millennia, the precision of these observations continues to astonish modern scholars. Comparisons with contemporary astronomical models reveal that many of the Sumerians' records were accurate, at least within the observational tools available to them. Without telescopes or mechanical instruments, they tracked cyclical patterns and made predictions with remarkable skill. In doing so, they laid the foundations for the scientific astronomy that would later flourish under the Babylonians, Greeks, and beyond. And yet, we are left with lingering questions. How did Sumerian priests conceptualize the forces they observed? Did they perceive the planets as divine beings, as messengers, or as autonomous forces with predictable behavior? To what extent did ritual shape observation, and observation shape ritual in turn? The answers remain partially obscured, recorded in symbols whose full meaning is still debated, reminding us that every tablet is both evidence and enigma. In the end, the Sumerians' gaze toward the heavens reflects a profound human impulse to understand our place in the universe, to find patterns amidst chaos, and to seek connection with forces larger than ourselves. Their observations, etched in clay, speak across millennia, bridging the gap between devotion and inquiry, between myth and proto-science. They remind us that, even in the earliest cities, humans looked upward with reverence, curiosity, and awe. And so, as we contemplate the star catalogues, lunar cycles, and eclipse records left behind by the scribes of Nippur, Uruk, and other sacred centers, we recognize a civilization whose wonder at the cosmos shaped both their religion and their understanding of time. Were they merely recording the sky, or were they listening for messages from the gods? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between, suspended in the night, where the Sumerians first traced the arc of the stars and glimpsed the eternal rhythm of the heavens. Chapter 21. Daily life in Sumer. Walking through the remnants of Sumerian cities, one cannot help but sense the hum of life that once filled these streets and courtyards. The grand ziggurats and palaces often capture the imagination, yet it is in the everyday spaces, the humble homes, the bustling workshops, and the open-air markets, that the rhythms of human existence in the first cities become most tangible. Archaeology allows us to reconstruct these lives in remarkable detail, revealing a civilization simultaneously sophisticated and vulnerable, radiant in creativity, yet bound by the fragility of survival. Most Sumerians lived in mud brick houses, arranged around central courtyards, where families gathered for meals, crafts, and conversations. These courtyards were the heart of domestic life, shaded by palm fronds, often containing a hearth for cooking, and spaces for grinding grain into flour. Clay vessels, ovens, and simple cooking implements attest to a culture that prized sustenance as both necessity and ritual. In these courtyards, women brewed beer, a staple of the Sumerian diet, while simultaneously overseeing the preparation of bread, which formed the foundation of daily meals. Beer and bread were not merely food. They were offerings to the gods, expressions of domestic piety and currency in social exchanges. Children, too, left traces of their presence. Tiny clay figurines, miniature tools, and toy animals suggest that play was an integral part of Sumerian childhood, preparing them for adult tasks while providing moments of joy. These toys, often unearthed in the same households as baking ovens and storage jars, offer a vivid contrast to the more monumental aspects of Sumerian society, reminding us that life was lived in small, intimate gestures as much as in grand projects. The Sumerian economy and administration permeated daily life. Clay tokens, often shaped like animals or geometric forms, were used to account for grain, livestock, and labor, eventually evolving into cuneiform writing. These tokens, found in homes and temple storerooms alike, reflect a society that meticulously monitored its resources. Yet they also reveal the interconnectedness of work, ritual, and governance. A household might simultaneously tend a small garden, oversee the care of animals, and participate in temple offerings, blurring the line between domestic and civic responsibilities. Farmers worked tirelessly under the scorching sun, tending to barley and wheat fields that fed both their families and the larger urban populations. The irrigation canals that crisscrossed the plains of southern Mesopotamia required constant maintenance, linking individual labor to the survival of entire communities. Inscriptions and administrative tablets record the allocation of water, the scheduling of fieldwork, and the rationing of grain, a glimpse into the careful planning that sustained life in one of the world's first densely populated regions. Yet alongside this vibrancy, the fragility of existence is ever present. Many texts recovered from Sumerian homes are prayers for health, protection, and divine favor. Illness, famine, or social unrest could threaten even the most stable household. Families invoked gods like Ninhursag, Ninlil, or Nana, seeking their benevolence in everyday affairs. The very act of writing these prayers onto clay, preserving them for posterity, reflects both a practical concern and a deep spiritual consciousness. Each prayer is a testament to human vulnerability, to the awareness that life's continuity relied on forces often beyond human control. Marketplaces were another center of daily interaction. Traders, artisans, and farmers gathered to exchange goods, negotiate prices, and share news. Sumerian seals and tokens played a crucial role here, ensuring authenticity and recording transactions. The marketplace was a space where domestic, economic, and social spheres overlapped, where the simple act of trade carried both practical and symbolic weight. Through these interactions, we see a society that balanced survival with social cohesion, commerce with ritual, and necessity with creativity. The architecture of Sumerian homes also speaks to values and priorities. Courtyards provided light and ventilation, while interior rooms offered storage and privacy. Clay tablets and small figurines were often kept in niches or shelves, suggesting an attention to order and the safeguarding of possessions. Even the smallest household objects, from grinding stones to oil lamps, reveal careful craftsmanship and daily utility, reminding us that innovation was not confined to temples or palaces but threaded through ordinary life. Sumerian society was structured yet intimate. Kinship, labor, and devotion intertwined seamlessly, creating a network of obligations and relationships that defined each person's role. Women, for example, were central to domestic economy and ritual practice, brewing beer, baking bread, weaving textiles, and caring for children. Men labored in fields, canals, and workshops, but often participated in local governance or temple duties. These overlapping responsibilities created a rhythm of life that was both ordered and fragile, dependent on cooperation, skill, and the favor of the gods. Even as we reconstruct these daily routines from clay tablets, household artifacts, and architectural remains, a sense of distance remains. The lives of Sumerians are at once intimate. A child's toy, a woman's hearth, a father's account, of grain rations, and remote, frozen in time, carried across millennia by fragile clay and fleeting inscriptions. We sense their laughter, their prayers, their labor, but we cannot step fully into their world. We are observers, tracing the outlines of a civilization whose pulse is recorded in mud, stone, and cuneiform. The study of daily life in Sumer offers a meditation on the persistence of human concerns, survival, nourishment, family, and devotion. It reminds us that even in the shadow of monumental temples and imperial ambitions, life unfolded in small, enduring gestures. Each meal prepared, each toy played with, each token recorded, was a moment in a human story that resonates across thousands of years. As the sun rises over the ancient plains, illuminating the remains of courtyards, hearths, and canals, one can almost hear the quiet rhythms of Sumerian life. The grinding of grain, the clink of tokens, the laughter of children, the prayers whispered to distant gods. And though the cities have fallen and the voices of their inhabitants are silent, the traces they left behind speak with remarkable clarity, inviting reflection on a world that is at once ancient, tangible, and profoundly human. Chapter 22: The Decline of Sumerin. The fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, where once the ziggurats of Lagash, and Nippur rose like terraced mountains of devotion, a profound transformation was underway. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Sumerian cities, which had once pulsed with administrative energy, scholarly activity, and ritual observance, were entering a period of steady decline. Their streets grew quieter, their temples less frequented, and the clay tablets that recorded the rhythm of daily life became increasingly scarce. The reasons for this fading of Sumerian civilization are complex, woven from environmental stress, political upheaval, and the shifting currents of human migration. Environmental evidence suggests that the land itself may have conspired against the Sumerians. Prolonged irrigation, necessary to sustain dense urban populations, gradually led to salinization of the soil. Fields that once yielded abundant barley and wheat began to falter under the weight of accumulated salt. Crop failures became more frequent, and with them, the fragility of the urban economy was exposed. Inscriptions from the period evoke a sense of catastrophe. The storm swept away the city, they lament, a phrase repeated across different city-states, perhaps both literal and metaphorical, conveying both floods and societal collapse. Political pressures compounded these environmental challenges. Amorite tribes, long present on the margins of Mesopotamia, began to establish dynasties in key cities. Their rise marked a gradual shift from Sumerian hegemony to new centers of power. Kings with Amorite names ruled in places once dominated by Sumerian lineages, introducing different administrative practices and cultural priorities. Yet even as political control shifted, the Sumerian language and traditions persisted. Scribal schools continued to teach cuneiform, preserving literary and religious texts, ensuring that Sumerian knowledge would survive, even as the political landscape transformed. The decline was not sudden, but insidious, a slow erosion of cultural cohesion. Urban centers, once meticulously planned and densely populated, began to fragment. Some cities were abandoned entirely, others persisted, their temples maintained by a fraction of the original populace. Trade networks weakened, and the intricate bureaucratic systems that had allowed Sumerian city-states to flourish became increasingly strained. Archaeological layers from this period reveal a patchwork of occupation, with rebuilding efforts punctuated by periods of neglect. Yet in the midst of decline, the Sumerian legacy endured in remarkable ways. Literary and religious texts continued to circulate, copied by scribes in temples across Mesopotamia, hymns to Enlil and Inanna, administrative lists, lexical compendia, and epic narratives like the Epic of Gilgamesh were preserved in clay, a silent testimony to the resilience of intellectual and spiritual life. Even as political authority passed to Amorite rulers, these texts formed the backbone of cultural memory, guiding new generations in ritual, law, and scholarly practice. Contemporary inscriptions reflect a consciousness of fragility. Some lament the disruption of order, the collapse of civic structures, or the loss of agricultural productivity. Others interpret environmental or political upheavals as signs of divine displeasure, reinforcing the sense that Sumerian decline was both material and moral, cosmic as well as human. In these texts, we hear voices struggling to reconcile the world they knew with the one emerging around them, capturing the tension between memory and transformation. Despite these challenges, Sumerian culture did not vanish entirely. Its language, preserved in liturgical, scholarly, and administrative contexts, continued to be taught long after native speakers had diminished. For centuries, scribes wrote in Sumerian as a classical language, much as Latin or Sanskrit would be used in later civilizations. In this way, Sumerian ideas, its myths, legal concepts, and literary achievements were transmitted to Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian societies, leaving a lasting imprint on the broader Near Eastern world. The archaeological record mirrors this layered continuity. Urban ruins show evidence of both abandonment and adaptation. New construction atop older foundations, new rulers occupying old palaces, and temples maintained even as the population dwindled. Clay tablets, often preserved by fire or accidental burial, provide a window into a civilization that had reached the height of urban sophistication, only to recede into memory. Each artifact, each inscription, is a fragment of a society aware of its own vulnerability, yet committed to the preservation of knowledge. In contemplating the decline of Sumer, one senses a civilization at the threshold between endurance and disappearance. The great achievements of urban planning, writing, and religious organization had transformed human society, yet they were vulnerable to forces both natural and human. Salinized fields, migratory pressures, and the shifting tides of political power converged to unseat cities that had once seemed eternal. And yet, in the scribal schools, in the continued worship of Enlil, and in the meticulous copying of texts, Sumerian culture found a way to persist, leaving behind echoes that would resonate for millennia. The story of Sumer's decline is therefore both a tale of loss and of survival. While political structures crumbled and the landscape changed, the intellectual and spiritual achievements endured. The city-states faded from dominance, yet their ideas, stories, and administrative practices became part of the foundation for civilizations that followed. In this way, Sumer did not vanish. It transformed, leaving behind a legacy that would inform rulers, priests, and scribes long after the Tigris and Euphrates carried away the last of its clay-built palaces. And so, in the quiet layers of Lagash and Nippur, we trace a civilization that, though diminished, left a record of human ingenuity, devotion, and resilience. Its decline reminds us that even the most sophisticated societies are not immune to environmental and political pressures. Yet it also demonstrates the remarkable capacity of culture to endure beyond its temporal and geographical bounds. In the silence of abandoned streets, in the fragments of tablets and temple walls, the Sumerians continue to speak. A civilization fading from power, but never from memory. Chapter 23. Rediscovery of Sumer. For nearly 2 millennia, the cities of Sumer lay silent beneath the shifting sands of southern Mesopotamia, their streets, temples, and palaces swallowed by time. The memory of Uruk, Nippur, and Lagash vanished from living history, surviving only in fragmented echoes, brief references in later Mesopotamian texts, faint myths, and the occasional allusion in biblical accounts. The civilization that had once created the first cities, codified the earliest laws, and recorded human thought in clay seemed lost entirely, a ghost of antiquity hidden beneath layers of soil and desert. It was not until the 19th century that the world began to remember Sumer. Explorers and archaeologists, driven by curiosity and imperial ambition, ventured into the plains of what is now southern Iraq. Among them was Austin Henry Layard, whose excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh revealed the grandeur of Assyrian civilization and hinted at even older cultures beneath. Soon after, Leonard Woolley's meticulous work at would captivate the world. Excavating the royal tombs, Woolley uncovered a wealth of artifacts, jewelry, ceremonial objects, and cuneiform tablets, preserved beneath layers of sand and the weight of centuries. These discoveries offered the first tangible proof that Sumer had been real, not merely myth or legend. The work of these early archaeologists was painstaking. They chipped away at mounds, layer by layer, often contending with harsh conditions, flooding, and bureaucratic obstacles. Each trench revealed streets, temples, and domestic spaces, a city frozen in time. When Woolley uncovered the royal tombs of he was met with treasures that spoke of opulent rituals and profound social complexity. Gold headdresses, musical instruments, intricately carved jewelry, and the remains of human attendants interred with their kings. Every object, every fragment of pottery suggested a civilization of extraordinary sophistication, one whose influence stretched far beyond its small geographic footprint. Yet the most revolutionary aspect of rediscovery came not from gold or statuary, but from the clay tablets. Thousands of them, inscribed in wedge-shaped cuneiform script, lay buried in temples, archives, and private homes. The decipherment of this script, completed gradually over the 19th and early 20th centuries, opened a door to a world that had been silent for millennia. Suddenly, letters, administrative records, hymns, myths, and contracts could be read and understood. Sumer was no longer an enigma. It became a civilization whose voices could be heard across time. Through these texts, we gained insight into the lives of Sumerians at every level of society. Temple economies, trade networks, family structures, and daily routines became visible in remarkable detail. Scholars discovered not only the practicalities of governance and commerce, but also the mythic imagination of a people who contemplated the cosmos, chronicled floods, and created epic tales of heroes like Gilgamesh. Each tablet added a brushstroke to a civilization long obscured, revealing both the ordinary and the extraordinary, the mundane and the sacred. Despite these breakthroughs, much of Sumer remains hidden. Thousands of tablets are still untranslated, their content waiting to reshape our understanding. Some may hold forgotten myths, others administrative records that challenge our assumptions about ancient governance, while some may contain knowledge that bridges the material and spiritual, as did the cylinder seals or flood narratives. The incompleteness of this archive underscores a profound truth. The story of Sumer, though partially recovered, is still being written. Each excavation, each deciphered line, brings new clarity, but also new questions. Rediscovery also altered our perspective on human history. Before Sumer, the narrative of civilization had been largely centered on later empires: Egypt, Greece, Rome. The uncovering of Sumer forced historians to reconsider the origins of writing, urbanization, and statecraft. The Sumerians had codified laws, built monumental architecture, organized trade, and recorded literature centuries before other civilizations emerged. Their rediscovery reshaped our understanding of the roots of politics, religion, and culture, revealing a civilization whose influence resonates through millennia. the physical remnants of Sumer, temples, ziggurats, canals, and city walls, provide a tangible connection to this long-lost world. Archaeologists and historians walk among these ruins, piecing together a society that once thrived in an environment both harsh and fertile. The careful excavation of layers of earth reveals a civilization attentive to detail, capable of sophisticated engineering, administration, and artistic expression. Yet the ruins also convey absence. Entire streets and neighborhoods are lost, evidence of ordinary life buried or destroyed, reminding us that even the most enduring societies are vulnerable to the passage of time. Modern technology has continued to advance the rediscovery of Sumer. Remote sensing, satellite imagery, and digital modeling allow archaeologists to map ancient cities without disturbing them, tracing canals, roads, and urban layouts invisible at ground level. Each new discovery adds depth to our understanding, revealing patterns of settlement, water management, and social organization that had long been obscured. Even so, every revelation brings new mysteries. Collapsed structures, unexplained artifacts, and fragmented texts challenge us to reconsider assumptions about Sumerian life and thought. Rediscovery is not merely an academic exercise. It reconnects humanity with its earliest attempts to organize, govern, and comprehend the world. By studying Sumer, we witness the birth of writing, law, monumental architecture, and urban society. We hear echoes of prayers whispered thousands of years ago, read contracts signed with cylinder seals, and trace trade routes that linked distant lands. Sumer emerges not just as a subject of study, but as a mirror reflecting the ingenuity, resilience, and creativity inherent in human civilization. And yet, for all that has been uncovered, the deserts of Iraq still guard countless secrets. Mounds that once held vibrant cities await careful excavation. Clay tablets, fragile and unread, lie buried under layers of sand, awaiting translation. Every discovery reminds us that history is incomplete, that knowledge is always provisional, and that the past, though rediscovered, can never be fully possessed. Sumer's story continues to unfold, fragment by fragment, inviting us to explore, to question, and to imagine the world as it once was. In the quiet galleries of museums, under the soft illumination of display cases, the artifacts speak softly of a civilization once thought lost. Through careful excavation, patient scholarship, and the enduring curiosity of humanity, the Sumerians have returned from oblivion. Yet even now, as tablets remain untranslated and ruins await exploration, the rediscovery of Sumer feels less like a conclusion and more like a threshold, a doorway into a civilization that continues to challenge, inspire, and mystify. Chapter 24, The Legacy of Sumerian. The soft glow of the desert sunrise, one can almost imagine the cities of Sumer rising from the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia. Though their mud brick walls have long crumbled and the ziggurats stand as weathered shadows of former grandeur, the imprint of Sumerian civilization persists, subtle yet profound, across the currents of human history. From the invention of writing to the codification of law, from meticulous observations of the heavens to the myths that shape our collective imagination, Sumer's achievements were not isolated wonders. They were the seeds of a cultural revolution whose echoes continue to resonate across millennia. Writing, the cuneiform script etched into clay, remains perhaps the most tangible of these legacies. First used to record economic transactions, inventories, and rations, it evolved into a medium for literature, law, and theology. Tablets preserve hymns to gods and kings, administrative lists, and epics such as Gilgamesh, revealing a society that sought to understand itself, its deities, and its place in the cosmos. The innovation of writing did not remain confined to Sumer's borders. Akkadian scribes adopted cuneiform, Babylonian kings recorded their decrees, and scribal schools for centuries continued to transmit the Sumerian language as a classical medium. In doing so, Sumer became the unseen teacher of civilizations that followed, its influence encoded in every wedge-shaped mark pressed into clay. Law, too, carries the enduring voice of Sumer. Codes such as that of Uruk reflect a civilization attempting to balance justice, social order, and human responsibility. These early legal formulations reveal a concern not only for punishment, but for restitution, fairness, and the maintenance of communal harmony. Later codes, Hammurabi's among them, would draw upon these principles, formalizing justice in ways that echoed Sumerian precedents. Through law, Sumerian civilization sought to structure not only the city-state but the human heart, leaving a model for governance that would reverberate across the ancient Near East. Sumerian engagement with the heavens offers another testament to their legacy. Priests recorded eclipses, planetary motion, and star risings with remarkable precision, developing lunar calendars and early star catalogues. These observations were intertwined with ritual and divination, yet they also constitute the earliest threads of scientific inquiry in recorded history. The methods and systems devised by Sumerian skywatchers would be refined by the Babylonians and later civilizations, laying the foundations for astronomy as both a practical and philosophical pursuit. The Sumerians observed not simply to predict harvests or divine favor, but to trace patterns in the cosmos, to map the rhythms of existence, and to reconcile the celestial with the terrestrial. Perhaps most enduring, however, is Sumerian myth and literature. Stories of creation, divine councils, and great floods echo through time, shaping the narratives of cultures far removed from the Fertile Crescent. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its meditation on mortality and friendship, survives as a mirror in which later generations would see reflections of their own existential concerns. Tales of gods deliberating over the fates of mortals, of towers reaching toward heaven, of waters sweeping across the land, find resonance in biblical and Near Eastern traditions, revealing a continuum of human imagination that begins with Sumer. These myths preserved ethical, cosmological, and cultural knowledge, ensuring that even when political structures fell, the Sumerian worldview endured. Beyond literature and law, Sumer's practical innovations also shaped the trajectory of human civilization. The wheel, the plow, and advanced irrigation techniques transformed agriculture, transport, and craft. Cities grew, trade expanded, and societies became increasingly complex. Urban planning, temple administration, and economic record-keeping in Sumer laid the groundwork for centralized governance, demonstrating that the city-state could be a laboratory for human ingenuity. These advances were not merely technical. They were frameworks for organizing human life, for connecting society with the divine, for extending the reach of culture across space and time. Sumerian influence spread through Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, carried by scribes, merchants, and priests. Even as political control shifted from one dynasty to another, the cultural and intellectual structures established in Sumer continued to guide the region. Akkadian rulers employed Sumerian language and literature to legitimize their authority. Babylonian astronomers refined techniques first developed in Sumer. Temple rituals preserved Sumerian hymns and incantations long after native speakers had dwindled. The Sumerian imprint thus persisted not as a relic of conquest, but as a living tradition, a foundational layer upon which successive civilizations built their own identities. Yet the legacy of Sumer is not confined to the Near East. Its influence can be traced in the development of complex societies across the globe. Concepts of law, urban organization, literacy, and astronomical observation find parallels in distant cultures, hinting at the universal challenges faced by early civilizations and the creative solutions Sumer pioneered. In every case, Sumer reminds us that the first great experiment in civilization was fragile, dependent on rivers, soils, and social cohesion, yet astonishingly resilient in the forms of knowledge it bequeathed. Even today, the traces of Sumerian thought endure in the stories we tell, the symbols we use, and the questions we ask. Flood myths, tales of gods deliberating over the fates of humans, the pursuit of knowledge and justice, all echo with origins in the clay tablets and temple archives of southern Mesopotamia. Their innovations in writing, governance, and observation have shaped the way we understand time, law, and the cosmos itself. To study Sumer is to confront the dawn of civilization, to witness humanity's first attempt to shape the world consciously, and to recognize the fragility and brilliance of that endeavor. And yet, for all we know, Sumer was only the beginning. Beyond the rivers of southern Mesopotamia, there may have been other experiments in human organization and imagination that left no trace. Other civilizations whose dawns remain buried beneath sands, silt, or the deep ocean. Sumer's survival in memory and artifact invites us to consider not only what has been preserved, but what has been lost. Its enduring presence reminds us that civilization is both delicate and enduring, that human creativity can illuminate the world in ways that persist long after walls crumble and rulers vanish. As we look back across 5,000 years, We see in Sumer the contours of our own questions. How do humans construct meaning, organize society, and seek connection with the divine? How does knowledge endure when empires fail? The Sumerians experimented with the fundamentals of human life: writing, law, ritual, and science. And though their cities faded, their ideas continued to shape the world, becoming the scaffolding for all who came after. In contemplating the legacy of Sumer, we recognize a civilization that was fragile yet luminous, fleeting yet foundational. It invites reflection on the continuity of human endeavor and the power of culture to transcend time. The rivers may have shifted, the cities crumbled, and the spoken language faded. Yet the Sumerians' innovations, their stories, and their records still speak. They are a reminder that the dawns of humanity are often ephemeral, yet their light can cast shadows that reach across millennia, shaping thought, law, and imagination long after their creators have vanished. And so, in the echoes of flood myths, in the careful wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform, in the precision of early astronomy and the enduring wisdom of their laws, Sumer continues to whisper. It is a civilization that, though ancient and lost, remains profoundly present, an invitation to wonder at the ingenuity, curiosity, and spirit of the people who first turned the rivers of Mesopotamia into the crucible of civilization. In their legacy, we are reminded that the past is never truly gone. It lives on in every story we tell, every law we enact, and every gaze lifted to the stars.